Welcome everyone. So the Roman conference is continuing today with workshops as well. And our workshop on lifelong learning for long-term human-robot interaction will start now and will last till 12:45 GMT plus 2. So the organizers of the workshop are myself. I'm Dr. Hatice Güneş, based at University of Cambridge's Department of Computer Science. And we have Associate Professor Sinan Kalkan, who was a visiting researcher with us in Cambridge, but also is a faculty at the Middle East Technical University in Ankara, Turkey. And also Herman Parisi, who is a researcher at University of Hamburg. He is currently based in the US, so he can't join us. It's very early in the US, early morning hours. So the aims of the workshop, you might have seen already on the website. But we really wanted to bring together multidisciplinary views to identify and address some of the key challenges. So this is the first workshop, and we hope to continue actually depending on the interest. And more specifically, the aims are studying long-term and lifelong learning and its relevant aspects for social robotics. And therefore, we are part of Roman in both lab and field settings.
Okay, let me continue from where Hatice left off. In the direction of these goals, we identified three important challenges. The first one is what can we learn from social sciences like psychology and neuroscience, for which we included an invited talk from a researcher from the Department of Psychology. The next challenge, important challenge, is what can we learn from machine learning? And for this, we have some contributed talks, and we have an invited talk. Another challenge, important challenge, is what should be addressed while adopting lifelong learning methods for HRI and social robotics. And for this, we included invited talks, and there are contributed papers. So this is going to be a half-day workshop, composed of 3 invited talks and 3 contributed papers. And then we have an additional talk to set the scene that was presented at Roman a few days ago, titled Continual Learning for Effective Robotics, Why, What, and How. Our invited speakers are Zoe Kurtzi from University of Cambridge, from the Department of Psychology, Lola Canamero, who is a reader in adaptive systems at the University of Hertfordshire, and we have Vincenzo Lomonaco from University of Bologna and Continual AI.
We will start with the video by Nikhil. So this is actually a joint paper with myself and Sinan as well, and we really started investigating with this paper also how we can use lifelong learning for particularly affective robotics, because I've been working in affective computing for some time. So we really wanted to bring together machine learning aspects, looking at effective computing, but also effective robotics. So this was already presented as part of the main oral papers at Roman, but it's really relevant. It was one of the motivations as well for us as part of this workshop. So we would like to start with this video.
And taking you through why it is needed, what does it mean, and how do we achieve it. Let's get started. Effective robots are becoming ubiquitous. We see them involved in servicing us in restaurants, assisting the elderly in care homes, and slowly becoming our everyday companions. The widespread application of these robots demand that they're equipped with abilities to perceive users, their effective behavior and responses, and also learn how to interact with them. Starting with the perception model right out of the box, they must learn to interact and adapt with users during interactions, extend and apply this learning with other users, and then adapt to different user groups as well. This process of learning and adapting continues as the robot interacts with more and more users. So what is the problem with traditional approaches to learning? Well, robot capabilities are a result of models trained and fine-tuned in isolation on large benchmark datasets. This training, however, can be vastly different to real-world interaction settings and require robots to follow a cumbersome and costly process of relearning and adaptation. Continual learning, on the other hand, enables incremental integration of knowledge with sequentially made available data. These models are highly sensitive to data conditions, adapting with new information without forgetting the old. A continual learning algorithm adapts the current model using the newly acquired data about a task along with the past experience, updating both the model and the experience in the process. Let's consider a concrete example of personalized affect perception. In this setting, the robot is trying to perceive and understand the affective behavior of this user in home context, trying to engage them. Most traditional affect perception approaches are insensitive to contextual attributes and use a pre-trained perception mechanism that does not adapt. They ignore specific nuances in users' behavior and try to fit all users under one generic perception model. Continual learning, however, uses a pre-trained model only as a starting point but evolves with each user. Interactions with the users help gather more data, and the robot updates its model with each interaction, personalizing towards each user. Another example is the case of learning context-specific behaviors. Here, the robot is trying to learn to interact with and care for an elderly lady, reminding them to take their medicines. Although traditional reinforcement learning might also be able to learn such high-level tasks, they would require large amounts of interaction data and huge computation resources, yet learning very specific behaviors. Further, as human interactions are fluid and switch contexts frequently, this learning is even harder and may become intractable in real time. Interactive reinforcement learning does, however, provide a solution where humans become a part of the learning process of the robot. For the continual learning case, we propose to use such interactions to provide feedback to the robot. The robot might also acquire user-specific and task-specific contextual attributes, helping it improve its behavior with each ongoing interaction and with each user that it interacts. An effective robot, thus, would need to learn how to perceive user behavior, acquiring new instances of data for each interaction, while also learning to interact with the users. And this becomes multifold in real-world situations, where a robot not only needs to acquire new instances of learning for each user or a task, but also need to learn how to apply this understanding across subjects, learning new conceptual mappings. The continual learning paradigm is well suited for such learning, and effective robots would benefit from such learning methodologies. So all this sounds great. What is the problem, you might ask? Well, there are many challenges that need to be addressed for this to become a reality. Let's discuss some of them and see how we can attempt to address them. Firstly, person-specific data is limited and hard to acquire. As interactions are the only source of data, the robot might perform poorly during initial interactions, harming the user's experience. To address this, one solution could be to hold introductory rounds of interactions whenever the robot encounters a new task or a user. This will enable the robot to collect more data and update its learning before even starting a task. Yet, this data might also be limited and insufficient. Thus, generative models can also be applied to simulate additional data to augment learning. The other issue is obtaining ground truth evaluations. This is an issue particularly for affect perception, as human affect is subjective and ground truth varies between users and contexts. Unsupervised learning is usually applied to get around this problem, but in real-time interactions, this might also become intractable. We suggest to focus on learning normative baselines by holding initial interactions in context-neutral settings. This will help establish a norm for the user behavior, and deviations from such norms can be easily detected using continual learning approaches. Additionally, grouping the users together using contextual attributes of personality or gender can help speed up learning initially and then can be later fine-tuned during interactions. Another problem in real-world interactions is that human interactions are fluid and move back and forth between contexts. Further, these contexts might overlap and the robot would have a tough time keeping up with the changing environments. To remedy this, continual learning models can be made context-aware by learning context-specific embeddings separately and using them as an additional input to the model. This would allow for a smarter context switching for the robot, facilitating interactions with humans. Another major issue for the robot is limited hardware capabilities they possess. The robot needs to balance memory with computation, both of which are essential for learning. Continual learning algorithms allow for slow forgetting in the models, where unimportant information is slowly forgotten, making way for new knowledge. Additionally, generative models can also be used to make robots more memory efficient, as well as apply cloud-based solutions that offer different robot functionalities as services, reducing the load on the robot. Finally, even if we are able to address all these challenges, an important concern for effective robots is to address the issue of fairness and reproducibility. Here, reporting continual learning metrics such as forward or backward transfer of information might help establish how the robot applies learning from one user to the other and how much of the user information is forgotten over time. Additionally, traditional metrics such as F1 scores and ROC statistics help establish QA standards for the robot performance. In the end, to sum up, we established that real-world interactions are complex and unpredictable and requiring effective robots to integrate new information on the fly. In particular, we discussed personalized affect perception and behavior learning as two concrete examples that stand to benefit from continual learning models the most, enabling lifelong evolution of robot capabilities. Here, I would like to thank my co-authors for their contribution as well as our sponsors. Thank you all very much for listening.
So we hope that this has enabled you to understand a bit more about what we aim with the workshop, or some aspects of it, in terms of bridging continual learning and effective robotics, including also some aspects of machine learning and social sciences. So we will follow now with Zoe Kurzi's invited talk. So this is a recorded talk. We apologize in advance because some of the slides have cut off bits as she recorded. She couldn't re-record it, unfortunately, but we will provide the slides later on our website, so you can access if you can't see some of the titles and so on. So Zoe Kurzi is a professor at the Department of Psychology, University of Cambridge. So her work aims to understand the role of learning and experience in enabling humans of all ages to translate sensory experience into complex decisions and adaptive behaviors. So this is really very relevant for us because we would like to understand better how humans learn through all ages, and hopefully we can gather some insights and inspiration from her talk as well, and how we can use this for social robotics.
Hi, and thank you for inviting me to speak to this symposium. I would like to talk to you today about how humans learn throughout the lifespan and how the brains reorganize and exhibit an incredible plasticity through training and through experience in life. So the question that we try to understand in our lab is, how do we make sense of the world around us? This is something that we don't only do when we gaze at the stars on a beautiful night looking for galaxies and planets. This is something that we do in our everyday life when we try to navigate a new environment or learn a new language. So how does the brain do it? In my lab, we take a multidisciplinary approach to answer this question, and we combine human behavior with recordings of brain activity, and also computational approaches for understanding these rich biological signals. We ask two main questions. One is, how does the brain use previous knowledge to interpret the current scene, to interpret the environment and the input that we engage with at any given point? And the second question that we ask is, how does the brain use previous knowledge from the past to predict the future. So I'd like to today give you some examples from our work trying to answer these questions, and I hope this will give you an idea about how the human brain learns and uses the past as a source of experience for dealing with the present and the future. So the first question we ask is, how do we interpret the world around us? The brain has a huge challenge. The signals that we deal with, the input we deal with in our everyday experiences is cluttered, is busy, and it's noisy. If you are in natural scenes or in big cities, you always have this experience of a very busy input. So the classical theory suggests that the way the brain copes with these busy scenes is by decomposing them into simple features, something like little wavelets of information, and then trying to process the different features, for example, the position, the orientation, the color of a scene separately, and then put them back together to be able to interpret a complex scene like this picture like this painting from Ilya Repin. It has been suggested that the brain during this process learns these features in a hierarchical manner. Early centers in the occipital cortex, where primarily visual input is analyzed, will compute very simple features like the position and the orientation of different features. And then as we move from the back of the brain towards more anterior in the brain, these features are combined into parts and into whole objects, into abstract categories, so that the brain can make sense of the world and assign meaning to different information. However, here we propose a different approach. We suggest that the brain doesn't simply decompose complex scenes into simple and more complex features, but the brain learns from experience what are the critical features to which one needs to pay attention in a scene, so that can quickly interpret the scene and understand the meaning and the intention depicted in a scene. How can we answer the question of whether the brain builds these behaviorally relevant, task-relevant structures is really a challenge. The way we approach this is by first creating a stimulus space that is unknown to participants in our study, so they don't have previous experience with, and to which we introduce quite a lot of noise so that the visual system is pressed to make difficult decisions. Then we create models that have all the information about the stimulus space, can make ideal decisions. We call this model ideal observers. And from these models, by interrogating their performance, we start understanding how potentially the human brain does it. We also collect behavioral responses, people's performance in specific tasks when they encounter these noisy stimuli, and their brain activity. And then what we do is we compare the human performance and the human brain activity to this ideal observer model, so that we can understand how humans solve the same problems like machines that have all the information about the stimulus space. So to give you an example, consider this study. What we did here is we created a stimulus space and we introduced noise. These are unfamiliar stimuli. And we presented one stimulus at a time to our participants, and we asked them to tell us whether they look more like this stimulus or like this stimulus. As you can see, what we've done here through interpolation between the extremes of the stimulus space is we created a space that we could then, through feedback, assign the stimuli in two classes. For example, this class where the stimuli look more like this, or this class where the stimuli look more like this. We present the participants with this type of stimuli that have quite a lot of noise in terms of local arrangement of the dots, and the task is very difficult. What we see is that through training, the participants learn. We use an ideal observer model to decompose the space and test what information is used for solving this problem, for assigning stimuli to class A versus class B. And what you see here is that there are certain features where the two classes represented in red and blue differ maximally, for example, here, here, and here. So then we look into the human behavior, and by using a classification method, we try to identify from the behavior images that represent this critical feature space for making the decisions. As you can see, before training, we cannot rectify from the participants' performance these critical features that allow the model to separate the two stimulus classes. But after training, you see that these critical features start appearing, and the two classes represented in red and blue here can be separated. The classification method is based on assigning the participant responses in two classes, A and B, and then subtracting the stimuli corresponding to the participant responses in the two classes from each other, and that's how we collect these images. We then turn into the brain that we map while participants are performing this task in an MRI scanner. What you see here is the visual cortex, starting from the occipital pole, the primary visual cortex, and extending anterior into more complex centers that analyze more complex visual information. Now, what we do in these areas is we extract in a higher, we extract the information that is processed in a hierarchical manner in these regions, and then we use a pattern classifier to extract information from the signals. This pattern classification is based on SVM machine learning approaches. So we train the classifiers with brain response from these different regions, and we test the classifiers and how well they can separate the stimuli that we presented the participants and the participant responses to class A versus class B. And what you see here is how the classifiers perform before training. We use the same classification approach when we analyze the response of the classifier. That is, we look at the classifier responses and we bin them for class A versus class B, and then we subtract the corresponding stimuli. And what you see in early visual cortex and in higher visual areas, we don't see any differences before training, and we don't see any of these critical features that are used for making the judgment, the classification judgment, appearing here. However, after training, what you see is that these features start appearing, these critical features for making a decision and separating the classes start appearing in higher visual areas, but not in early visual areas. We can quantify this by correlating the observed responses to the ideal responses. And here we take the distance between the stimulus classes, and you see that before training, there is no correspondence, while after training, we see a nice correlation emerging between what humans do and what our ideal observer model does, suggesting that humans start becoming more efficient in the classification tasks they perform. We do the same when we look at brain responses, and you see here that in early visual areas and in higher visual areas before training, the brain responses do not correspond to the ideal observer. But it's very clear that after training in higher visual areas, not in early visual areas, but in high visual areas, we see a nice correspondence between the ideal observer and the brain. Another interesting observation is that actually what we see is that the participants, as they become more efficient in making their judgments with training, they put more weight in the difficult features like this that vary less between the classes but are still very informative, and you see they weigh this information more for making their judgments, and we see the same reweighting of information in higher visual areas, not in early visual areas. So to summarize, what we see here is that when we have to make difficult judgments like categorizing abstract shapes with noise and learning abstract categories, individuals become more efficient in their decisions with training. Also, what training does is it changes the representations, it reweights the representations in higher visual centers so that these more abstract categories can be represented. Now, in the second question that I wanted to address here is asks how the brain uses past experience not for solving a problem that it's faced with, but for predicting what will happen in the future. As Neil Bohr says, it's difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. So how does the brain do it? So we first look at how the brain predicts event streams. And to do this, we devised a paradigm where we use very simple stimuli-oriented gradings in this case. These stimuli were presented in a sequence. So we used two orientations, left, right, and they were presented in a sequence. And after a while, this sequence stops. And what we ask the participants to do is predict which orientation will come up next, left or right. As you can see here, these were deterministic sequences we used. You see the participants learn nicely during training to perform this task and to predict the next stimulus in a sequence. We then looked in the visual cortex before and after training. We asked participants to perform the task in the scanner before and after training in the lab. And what you see here is the response to the sequence of stimuli. And then you see that this response decreases and it comes up at the test stimulus. The test stimulus is either a leftwards or a rightwards oriented grading, and the participants have to tell us whether this is what they expected or not. Now here, the interesting feature of our design is that between the sequence and the test stimulus, there was a long period of a gap. And we measured neural activity while there was no stimulus presented. And what you see as expected is when there's no stimulus presented to the visual cortex, the response goes down to baseline. You see there's no difference here before and after training when we have this long period of no stimulation. What we did then is we asked the question of whether actually there is any information here during this period that does not relate to the previous sequence presentation or to the test stimulus, but actually relates to the prediction that the participants are making. While the participants are experiencing the sequence of stimuli, then they are requested to make a prediction, and we ask whether there is any information we can extract from this prediction. So to answer this question, we took a pattern classifier and gave to the classifier the signal of the brain activity from this quiet period. And we asked the classifier to separate the activity related to a leftwards or a rightwards oriented grading. And this would be the activity related to the prediction of the participants. And what we see when we look at this is that after training, we have an increase in the classifier accuracy compared to before training, where classifier accuracy is at times in separating the prediction, the predicted orientation signal. So you can see this here when we look in primary visual cortex and in early visual areas. In general, what you see is that we have stronger classification accuracy. We can recover information related to the predicted orientation after training, but not before training. And this is not a case when we have a control task that requires just memorizing specific orientations rather than predicting as a control. So to summarize this first experiments tell us that actually the brain can keep information about the previous history of events and predict what will come up in the future. The work I showed you so far deals with simple events, sequential history. We then ask whether the brain can learn more complex sequences. And we were inspired to do this work by some seminal studies in infants that show that infants as young as 6 months old, they can actually extract temporal sequence from phonetic sequences. So in these experiments, infants were exposed to continuous speech, as you see here. And the interesting trick here is that there were some syllables and some sequences here of phonetic events that were more frequent than others. So for example, Toki Boo is more frequent than Boogie Call. And what the researchers discovered was actually that infants were sensitive to these frequently presented sequences. So we asked whether the brain can learn more complex sequences that potentially may relate to learning structure about complex temporal events, like, for example, language. So to do this, we devised a complex sequence of symbols, and the participants experienced this sequence, and then they were presented with a display of 4 symbols and had to indicate with a button press which one of these 4 symbols was the one they expected. What we did here is we varied the probabilities of the individual symbols or pairs or triplets of symbols, and therefore this required the participants to try and learn the structure. We used an adaptive learning procedure where we started with level 0 sequences where one of the items were more frequent than others. Then we moved into level 1 where we had pairs that were more frequent than others, and then we moved to second order, level 2, where some triplets were more frequent than others. What you see here is that for all 3 levels, the participants could learn the sequences. In fact, they started always from level 0, and then when they learn level 0, they move to level 1 and then to level 2. We then built a model that learned from the participant responses and tried to extract information about how the participants learn these complex probabilistic structures. So the first thing that we interrogated with the model is how the participants learn the context length, how they learn how deep the structure is. And the second thing we interrogated is whether the participants learn the right contingencies or whether they learn the right pairs, for example, or triplets. And what we observed is that the participants learned, but at different rates. So as you see here, some participants extract information from the sequences faster than others. And we color-coded these through clustering analysis, into red and blue, so that you can see how we have effectively 2 classes of individuals. Although we have a continuum of responses, they can be clustered into faster learners and slower learners. And so we asked whether there was something in the decision strategies of these individuals that was different and potentially related to our speed in extracting this complex structure information. To test this, we built 2 models, a model of matching and maximization. These are well-known decision strategies that have been suggested to be adopted when participants make probabilistic decisions. So the matching strategy suggests that participants try to learn exactly the statistics of the scene. So if an event appears, if A appears more frequently than B, then they will select A more frequently than B. The maximization model suggests that participants will select an item or an event that is more frequently rewarded or more frequently appears. So if A appears 80% and B only 20%, participants will always select A to maximize their reward. Now, what is interesting here is that we did not give explicit feedback to the participants, so we did not reward them for their choices. They were exposed to these complex sequences and they learned without feedback. So there's no reward in this case. We then analyze the data based on the participants' strategies. And what we see is that the red participants, the ones that are learning faster to extract abstraction, are the participants that started deviating from the matching line towards maximization, while the slower participants are the participants that seem to stick with a matching strategy and try to learn exactly the statistics of the sequence space. We then looked at the brain activation while participants perform this task. And in fact, we analyzed the data by including as a regression and analysis the strategy, the decision strategy that participants used. A negative decision strategy means that participants use more of a matching strategy. And what you see here is that we recover a network of areas that involves the hippocampus, basal ganglia, and visual cortex. This is known as the visual loop in reinforcement learning. And we see this visual loop here without explicit reward relating to a matching strategy. In contrast, when participants used more of the maximization strategy, what we see is a different network of areas being activated that involves frontal and subcortical regions. And this is known as the executive and motivational loop that supports goal-directed behavior. The results that I presented from this study suggest that human learners can extract complex structure and learn complex structure without explicit feedback, and they use different strategies, and matching strategies that relates more to visual cortical striatal circuits versus maximization strategy that involves more frontal striatal circuits. How do we know that these circuits are actually connected? The work I showed you before looked at functional MRI activation. Here we pursued also connectivity analysis, both structural and functional connectivity analysis. And what you see here is on the structural connectivity analysis, we see the same visual loop involving hippocampus and basal ganglia relating to matching, while frontal striatal loop relating to maximization. So to summarize then, what we have is two circuits, one involved in matching, which is a cortical striatal circuit, and another involved in maximizing, which involves frontal striatal circuits. These two different circuits supporting different learning strategies are really important because the brain can reorganize to choose one of the two, and that can be really important in, for example, cases of degeneration because of aging or brain damage. Looking at whether the brain can still learn in older age and use these circuits, we have tested older individuals over 75, and we see that they can still learn these complex tasks. And the same applies for individuals that suffer from mild cognitive impairment that is marked by impairment in memory primarily, and we see that these individuals can learn and extract information from these complex structures. And interestingly, what we see is that individuals with memory impairments, they use primarily these frontal striatal circuits compared to healthy controls that have the capacity to also use memory circuits. So to summarize, and I apologize about the technical problems, I hope I have given you some examples of how the human brain can use experience and learning to solve problems, interpret the current scene, but also the future from the past. And the next challenge for us is really to understand how the same learning can be used in artificial systems, how we can have both biological and artificial lifelong learners. And we are building models in the lab that allow us to understand the human brain, but also using what we learn about the human brain from neuroscience, from brain imaging, to build more humanized artificial systems. So I'd like to close by thanking everybody in my lab who has contributed to all of this work over the years, and also our funders. And thank you again for your attention, and look forward to your questions at the Q&A. Thank you.
Hi, Zoe. Thank you very much for this talk. Actually, I didn't realize because your name appears differently. I just sent you an email because I thought you were not online.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. This is my lab account.
No problem. It's good to see your face.
I couldn't, for some reason, I couldn't rename it, but
no problem. Thanks a lot. This was very helpful. I just would like to now open the floor for questions. No one has typed anything, so I just want to remind you, everyone, if you have any questions, please type on the chat and we can ask. But in the meantime, I will start with some questions myself. When you talk about learning in terms of human learning in your experiments, can you maybe briefly explain what this refers to? Do they just go through tasks and then you give them, I don't know, like marks, or you say this was wrong? Is it binary, yes, no? Or how does the feedback appear, and how do they really learn in that case?
Yeah, so we devise different protocols. Typically, we do this work in the lab, although now we are moving online. The first visit, our participants are volunteers to the lab. We test them on some tasks without giving them any feedback. This is kind of like a baseline measurement. We want to see what is their performance before they're ever trained in a task. The different tasks, we try to kind of manipulate the complexity and the difficulty of the task so that the human brain is a little stressed and a little bit depressed, so that we can get timely responses from the participants. In the beginning, they're really hard. They won't be accurate and they'll be a bit slow. If we do brain imaging, we will also put them in the scanner and collect brain responses the first time ever they experience a task. Mm-hmm. Then we bring them in the lab for several sessions, depending on the protocol. It could be 3 to 5 sessions, or it could be when we do adaptive training where we change the difficulty, could be more, like we've done protocols that last up to 3-4 weeks. Mm-hmm. During this training, typically we give them feedback. So every time we will have them make a judgment. So we call this a trial. A stimulus will appear and we'll ask them, for example, is this a stimulus from category A or from category B? They'll give a response with a button press. And then we give them feedback. We tell them if they got it right or if they got it wrong. Mm-hmm. And this is kind of like the, a typical paradigm for reward or reinforcement learning. Mm-hmm. And then at the end of their training, we test them again without any feedback. And what we usually compare is how well they did after the training compared to before the training, when they were doing the task without any feedback, so under the same conditions. And we also look at their learning rate during the training, how quickly, how fast they get better in the task when we are giving them feedback. Mm-hmm. We also run paradigms like you saw in the second half of the talk, where we never give them any feedback. That's not absolutely true, but we don't give them trial by trial feedback, which means every time they make a response, we will not give them feedback. And this type of paradigms I typically refer to as statistical learning. The idea is that you're learning without anybody telling you if you're right or wrong, but you're trying to pick up some regularities, some patterns, and of course you have some internal feedback. You know when you start getting the task and when you start feeling that it's easier. Mm-hmm. What we do in this case is we don't give people feedback on every response, on every decision they make, but we give them kind of what we call block feedback. So when they've done about 50 trials, for example, we show them a summary of their performance. Sometimes it will be like a bar that as they go along, it increases in height. And it's more like keeping them engaged and motivated, but they don't know at what instant they got it right or wrong. So these paradigms are kind of more like unsupervised learning, where the individuals have to learn based on what information they can gather across trials, and based on the internal feedback they have of, oh, I think I got it right, or I think I got it wrong.
Okay, so again, I'll ask if there are any questions. If not, I have more questions. So I have a second question. I'm interested in, because I actually teach affective computing, and there in one of the lectures, we also talk about affective priming before people do certain tasks. It's, I can't remember if we have the learning aspect as well, but I mean, I know this is not what you presented, but I just wanted to know your opinion, whether you considered, or if there's any work looking at priming before they start learning. It doesn't have to be affective. Of course, affective priming would be something I'm very interested in, or how affect or affective states affect the learning that you mentioned in terms of speed or efficiency and so on. So any comment would be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's interesting that actually we see this in our results a little bit. You know how I was saying the first time around, but the first time that they come to the lab, we have them do the task without any feedback. And people, think that, oh, then you shouldn't learn. But actually, everybody learns. So simply being exposed to the task, you learn. But I think what you refer with priming is simply some exposure to some stimuli or to some information, or even something that has kind of some associations with the task. It doesn't have to be even the same material, but could be semantically associated, or maybe affective. Maybe you can tell me a little bit more about.
Something like, for instance, if someone likes coffee, the smell, you make them smell coffee before they do the task. So it can be as simple as that. Or you make them listen to positive music before they do the task, or some fast music, or more neutral, like ocean waves or whatever.
So it's really interesting, because these are the things that we try to control for. Usually we say, oh, no other factors should affect performance, but that's not real life. In real life, all of these factors affect performance. And in fact, every time we experience a new situation, this is exactly what we do. We try to figure out any other cue that could give us a way to solve the task. And that's why we can operate really fast and successfully, even when we don't have the full information space. The information space usually we have is very noisy, is very ambiguous most of the times, but we need to make decisions. So we take advantage of any other cues, even if they're, kind of remotely related sometimes, but have some association, some relation with the task context. So although we haven't investigated this, there's a lot of evidence that priming actually affects your decisions, and you're speeded, and you might have either more positive outcomes in terms of your performance is better, or some biases. So you might actually make the wrong decisions because you're biased by some kind of previous input. And it's interesting that sometimes this input doesn't have to be external; it could be totally internal, in terms of you have a memory of a previous engagement in a completely different situation or task, but somehow is associated, or somebody gives you a cue that makes you believe it's associated, and therefore this now becomes your previous knowledge of a situation that you believe is similar, and you take this into account for the next kind of problem that you're trying to solve. So these, I think these are really kind of interesting questions. And we're doing some other work in the lab that could be very relevant. People believe in terms of, we have some evidence that the brain is never silent, is never at rest, is always at a preparatory state. And we can see this in brain oscillations. And it's quite likely that these previous experiences or associations affect the brain oscillations, the patterns of oscillations in the brain. This means they affect the preparatory state of the brain. And then when new information comes in, the brain is ready, or has some kind of inclination or bias or anything, whatever we will call it, previous experience based on which it can rely to solve the next problem. So it's really interesting. We're looking at EEG where we can record oscillations from the brain and effectively see how they might be affected by context, by previous experiences.
There's one question from the audience. I'll quickly summarize it. So the person says, thank you for the nice talk. I have a question about the machine learning models mentioned towards the end. Can you please elaborate a bit about the type of lifelong learning models you prefer, and in parentheses, regularization-based or pseudo-rehearsal-based for your experiments?
Yes, I think I'm gonna have to ask input from you on this. So the models we have used are primarily reinforcement learning models, but also and sort of Bayesian kind of learning models. So now we are looking at machine learning models, for example, convolutional nets. But they are not, I think they are looking primarily at the idea that you can have simpler and more complex input coming into the brain. And the current approach is a little bit naive in terms of it assumes that there is some kind of hierarchical complexity in the stimulus space and a similar complexity in the brain. And effectively are trying to match models that have different layers to complexity, stages of complexity in the processing. What we see is that it's not a one-to-one correspondence and that we need more complex models. So, for example, recently from the work that is done across different labs, we see that recurrence is a really important factor in the models for predicting human behavior. So these are really things that, you know, it'd be fantastic to be able to test, and we have a lot of human behavior data across the lifespan. It'd be really interesting, you know, to kind of look at these parallels of the lifelong learning machine learning models and the human data. But it's really a totally open space. Yeah. So anybody who wants data or have ideas, feel free to contact me. I'd be very happy to work with anybody.
Actually, I'm going to contact you after the workshop.
Sounds great. Yeah, it's a very exciting field. It's really a fantastic development that we are seeing.
We have one final question. I mean, final meaning because we are running out of time in terms of break, but I want to read that as also from the audience. As I gather, the training is conducted in rounds where the participants repeat the same tasks. If so, is there an effect of recall of past experience? Does this correlate with activation patterns in relevant brain areas?
Yeah, so if I recall, you mean explicit knowledge that people can tell you about, like I've learned about this in the previous session and now I'm going to use it. It's actually really interesting when we ask people, they don't have an explicit rule to apply. So in the task that people are learning these complex temporal sequences with the symbols, the sequence is guided by Markov models and different levels of complexity, depth in these models. We ask the participants if they notice anything. They say, well, there is a pattern, but I haven't figured it out. But somehow they do better. And at the very end of the training, we ask them, okay, did you notice something? Most participants can say, yes, I was looking for pairs, for example, but they can, and they might tell you the most frequent pair. But very rarely, actually, they have spotted explicitly that they can recall it. It's more this implicit, actually, understanding of the structure that clearly somehow our brains pick up before we can explicitly, you know, put this in words in some way. So this is also a really, you know, interesting space to work on. When do things become effectively conscious, like our decisions and our rules, and when actually we operate based on implicit information that our brains pick up from the environment and can use it to make decisions. If that's what it meant.
Yes, if not, maybe you can type, Nikhil, if that's what you meant or not. I think, Sinan, do you have a short question and then wrap it up? Yeah.
Actually, that was related to. Thank you, Zoe, again for this nice talk. It's really useful for us. So regarding the previous question, so in continual learning models, people usually use regularization techniques like, you know, you control the weights or the gradients, or you add new neurons or layers, or alternatively you re-provide some of the previous training instances to your learning model. I think these are the dominant models. So based on the high-level diagram that you provided at the end of your talk regarding the 3 brain regions and the 2 processes that go on between these regions, it seems that that suggests having an explicit memory in the learning model to be able to address lifelong learning. Is that a good summary? Then this suggests that continual learning models should either using rehearsal-based techniques or using an explicit memory model, like in recurrent architectures. Somehow integrate memory components, right?
Yeah, so yes, there has to be a memory. So it has to be a memory that can be actually quite dynamic in terms of learning from previous examples. It's depending on the strategy. So if you take the maximization strategy, that memory can be kind of fixed. So you say, oh, I identify the most frequent event or the most rewarded event. This memory I use all the time. And I always make a decision. When I make a decision, I always give a response that matches this memory. If you're using if you're using the matching strategy, you actually need to update this memory all the time, because if the contingencies change and if the probabilities change, if you're trying to match your response to the probabilities, then that memory has to be more dynamically changing potentially. So yes, I think it's really interesting, and we see this is typically people don't look at strategies. They assume that learning follows one system, and different types of learning follow different systems. So explicit versus implicit learning. What we actually see is that there are multiple systems, but they are driven by actually the way you approach the problem. Rather than different memory systems, it's more different kind of strategy, decision systems. And I think that relates much nicer to, as you're saying, continual learning models, because you can have different adaptations effectively of how the model learns. So yes, it will be really interesting to explore these parallels. And that's where I think the power comes in. We start understanding the brain through the modeling in a different way.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Zoe, again.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Thank you for this opportunity, and sorry for the technical problems.
I think we understood more or less. So we said we will share the slides on the website.
Yeah, I put the slides on OneDrive, and
okay.
Yeah, you've got my email, and I'm happy for you to pass on my email to anybody who might have any questions. And
okay, yeah. Great. Thanks again for your time.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
All right. Take care.
Thank you. Bye. We will now have a short break. We are a bit over time, but it was very nice discussion, so I couldn't really stop it in the middle. So we'll have a break, and then we will be back. Shall we say 5 minutes, Sinan?
Yeah. 5 minutes.
In 5 minutes, we'll be back, everyone. Sinan, would you like to introduce the papers? I've been talking a lot with Zoe, so maybe you can share this session.
Yeah. So hello everyone, after a short break. Now we will continue with the contributed papers. The first paper is on online learning of objects through curiosity-driven active learning. It's from Ali Ayub and Alan Wagner. The authors are going to be here after the pre-recorded video. So please type your questions in the chat box, and then they will be able to answer your questions.
Hi, my name is Ali Ayub, and I'll be presenting our paper, Online Learning of Objects Through Curiosity-Driven Active Learning. So children learn through curiosity. They ask about the things or the concept they are most unfamiliar with. And the whole process is extremely efficient because the child only has to ask about the things that he or she unfamiliar with, and the teacher doesn't have to answer any unnecessary questions. Further, children, and even all humans, learn in a continual manner. That is, they continually adapt to their environment by learning new things without forgetting any of the previously learned information. Now, with robots becoming an integral part of our society, like household or domestic robots, they must also learn through curiosity, because in real-world applications, they might not have enough human assistance, so they should prioritize the things that they are most unfamiliar with. Deep learning has achieved remarkable success in object classification. However, they require a large amount of training data to be labeled. But in real-world robotics applications, that's not the case because of limited human assistance and limited label data. So for that case, researchers have proposed active learning techniques in deep learning, which actually use uncertainty sampling to find most informative samples among the unlabeled data. However, these techniques still are applicable for batch learning scenarios. That is, they require all the training data to be available in a single batch, and they cannot be applied for continual learning. So in the past couple of years, deep learning researchers have focused on incremental learning, in which the model gets data in incremental steps, and it is supposed to perform well on previous data and new data. However, this runs into a new problem called catastrophic forgetting, in which the model actually forgets the previously learned information, and the overall classification accuracy of the model decreases. So to deal with catastrophic forgetting, many researchers have proposed continual learning techniques. But most of these techniques still require a portion of the old class data, which again is not memory efficient for real-world applications. Most of these techniques require a large number of training samples per class. Further, they also require all the training sample of a class in a single increment, which might not be the case in real-world scenarios when the data might be coming in a streaming manner, and samples for the same class can be coming in different increments. And lastly, these techniques are not suitable for uncertainty-based active learning. So in this paper, we deal with a combination of these problems, which is curiosity-driven online learning, in which the model gets streaming data, which is completely unlabeled, and it is supposed to find the most informative samples to get the labels off. And the entire process that we present is a self-supervised system for finding the curiosity scores for different samples. So for the continual learning part of our system, we use CBCLPR, which is Centroid-based concept learning with pseudo-rehearsal as a technique that has been shown to work with fewer examples per class and producing state-of-the-art results on different benchmarks. In this technique, the model actually gets the samples of each class in an incremental manner, and it gets the centroids and covariances of that class using a distance threshold as a hyperparameter. Next, for the pseudo-rehearsal phase, the model actually uses the centroids and covariance matrices of the previous classes and sample them in a form of a Gaussian distribution to get pseudo-exemplars, and then combines the pseudo-exemplars with the new feature vectors and train a shallow classifier composed of a linear layer based on a cross-entropy loss. And then the shallow classifier is used for getting the labels of test images. So CBCLPR was originally proposed for continual learning. However, for the online learning scenario, data for the same class can come in different increments. So we present an update to CBCLPR to deal with online learning. So in this case, when the data for a previous class does come, the model actually updates the previously learned centroids, again using the clustering process, using the distance threshold. And to update the covariance matrices of the previous classes using the new data, it actually finds the covariance of the new data from the newly updated centroids and gets a weighted mean of the previous covariances and the new covariances to get the overall covariance matrix for the previous class. So we're finding the curiosity scores for any new object. We actually present a self-supervised system in which the model actually uses the previously learned centroids by CBCLPR. So assume the model gets actually m unlabeled objects, and it has to get the label of k less or equal to m objects. And each object actually has multiple images taken from different views. So our curiosity term is actually composed of two terms. One is the average distance of each image of an object from the closest centroids of the previous classes. which shows that if the images are actually farther apart from a previous centroid, that image or that object should be unknown or should have a higher curiosity score. A second term is actually the normalized number of images that belong to the most predicted class among the centroids. So that actually shows that if the most number of images are actually not predicted to a particular class, that means it should have a higher curiosity score, because images of an object, even if taken from different views, should belong to a same class if it is previously known by the system. So to test our approach, we perform one experiment on Core 50 dataset, which was proposed for testing continual learning for robotics applications. The dataset consists of 10 classes with 5 object instances per class, and the dataset also has 11 sessions taken in different environments, with 3, 7, and 10th session for testing, and the others used for training. We use PyTorch to implement all the neural network models, and use ResNet 18 pre-trained on ImageNet as the feature extractor for CBCLPR, and the hyperparameter distance threshold for CBCLPR was tuned using cross-validation. So among the 8 training sessions, we combined them into 400 training instances, and in each increment, we sampled 5 instances randomly from the 400 training instances. And the robot or the model is required to get the label of one of the objects. Since there are no techniques for curiosity-driven online learning, so we actually use the CBCLPR as the online learning algorithm, and then test with our curiosity-based approach against the softmax-based uncertainty sampling and the random sampling technique. And for the test phase, we actually use the full test set with all the classes to test how well the model has learned all of the classes in each increment. And we only test for 50 increments instead of 400 increments, because after 50 increments, the model has learned pretty much all the classes, and the performance for all the approaches start to look pretty similar. So we tested in terms of 2 measures. One is the accuracy of the system in each increment, and the total number of classes learned by the system in each increment. We also performed 10 runs of the experiment and with random seeds, and take the average and standard deviation. And as you can see, on the left is the accuracy, and on the right is the number of classes learned by each model. And our model, curiosity-driven online learning, in red, actually performs better than the softmax-based and random sampling. In particular, you can also see that the softmax-based sampling or random sampling have a large standard deviation, which also shows that these techniques are dependent upon the order of the classes presented to the system or the objects presented to the system, but our approach actually is not dependent upon that, which means it is quite robust in real-world scenarios. So to summarize, in this paper we have tackled a novel problem, which is curiosity-driven online learning, and proposed a novel approach to tackle that problem. As a limitation, there was one limitation for our approach, in which we assumed that correct labels would be provided by the human, but in the real-world cases, there are scenarios when the labels can be deceptive or wrong. Nonetheless, our paper still contributes in many different ways. Like I said, the curiosity-driven learning is necessary for real-world scenarios with limited human assistance, and online learning of objects is also necessary to adapt to real-world dynamic scenarios. And lastly, we present quantitative evaluations of our approach and the problem on a benchmark dataset, so which can be used by future systems to compare against our approach. And lastly, for our future work, we will apply our approach on a real robot that is wandering around in our environment to learn about different objects through limited human assistance. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ali. Ali is here with us. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat box. In the meantime, I can ask some. Thank you, Ali, for the presentation. Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Ali.
Thank you for joining. So if you, for example, have very noisy data instances coming in, do you think your method would have any problem with such data, because the noisy data would be very distant to your previous centroids?
Yeah, that could be, I guess, one of the limitations. Like, because let's just say if the data is collected in a different lighting condition, the centroids might actually start to look a little different. So yeah, those could be the limitations. So in that case, the model will then say, okay, I need to get, so essentially the model will say, well, you know, these samples look a lot different than my previous representation. So I do need to update them, and they should be labeled. Because now, in a way, even though they do belong to the same class, it's just in a totally different environment. So yeah, essentially it should be labeled. Yeah.
There is one question, the chat box. Thanks for the interesting talk. Can you please briefly explain the centroid computation again, particularly in a purely online learning case?
Okay, well, so essentially the main hyperparameter that we use is the distance threshold. And we calculate the distance between any feature vector or the centroid using a Euclidean distance. That seemed to work the best. And based on the parameter, if let's just say a newly coming feature vector, or like the image's feature vector is further apart from a previously learned centroid of the same class, you create a new centroid using that feature vector of the new image. Unless otherwise you just update the previous centroid using a weighted mean with that. So this process kind of continues in an online manner using the distance threshold. It's kind of very similar to agglomerative clustering, if you're familiar with that. But that requires all the data to be available in one batch. But for the online case, you can just use it as a distance threshold and keep updating using that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. There's no other questions, so let me ask another one. So it was really relevant. So do you think it makes sense to make the lambda parameter adaptive? Currently it is fixed, right?
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I think it has an impact on the performance. So can you comment on that?
So lambda parameter is currently deciding how much contribution should be from the distance from the centroid and I guess I call it the label consistency between like all the images. I mean, yeah, I guess currently I didn't really try any particular technique to like any adapt technique. I think I set this value at 0.3, oh, sorry, 0.7. So like a lot less contribution from the consistency side. But yeah, I guess any adaptive technique might actually be, but the problem is the data is coming in an online manner. So I'm not sure currently how adaptively that could be set by the system, unless if it can get some kind of feedback from the human, well, you know, like based upon like if I'm getting the most informative samples or not. Because the robot will actually, or the system will say, okay, these are the samples that I'm most unfamiliar with. And then if it can get a feedback, well, actually, you know, they weren't. So then based on that, it can actually adapt. But that would probably require maybe an initial pre-training phase with some base classes. That could actually work. Yeah. That might be, yeah.
Thank you. So we need to proceed with the next paper. Thank you for joining in.
Yeah, of course.
So let me share the next one.
Hello.
Sorry, share my screen. The next paper is actually from us. It is on continual learning, social robot appropriateness of robot actions. The first author is Jonas John Land, and due to time conflicts, he couldn't join in. He won't be here, but we will be here and we will try to answer your questions if you have any.
Hello, my name is Jonas Chomslund, and on behalf of myself, Sinan Kalkan and Hatice Guns, I would like to present our work on continually learning social appropriateness of robot actions. As we all know, robots' role in society is steadily increasing. In the picture on the right-hand side here, we see a potential future scenario in a home environment where a domestic robot is trying to determine whether it is appropriate to start vacuum cleaning when observing this social situation or social context. We see that someone is laying on the sofa, maybe sleeping, there's children there, and it is difficult for the robots to determine whether it is appropriate to start with this action. Achieving such appropriate social behavior is not trivial, not even for humans. However, as humans, we have the ability to recognize social contexts and can link a social context to what actions that are appropriate to do in that context. We also have the ability to continuously learn from our observations and update our knowledge when faced with new social contexts and feedback about the appropriateness of actions. In our work, we approach the challenge of giving robots the same ability. We present two main contributions. We have created and labeled through crowd labeling a dataset of social appropriate labels for domestic robot actions in a home scenario. Using this dataset, we propose a Bayesian continual learning framework using existing continual learning methods to allow the model to continuously update its knowledge without forgetting previous experiences. The dataset is created in Unity. We simulated 1,000 different social contexts and looked at 29 features, such as, is music playing? Is there a group in the room? Is there someone on the sofa? Is there animals, children? We also investigate then 16 robots' actions and the social appropriateness of them. In such a social context, is it appropriate to do these 16 set of actions? To label the appropriateness of these actions, we used the crowdsourcing platform from Prolific. We were able to label 1,000 different scenes, where we asked annotators to indicate on a scale from 1 to 5, where 1 deemed as very inappropriate and 5 indicated very appropriate, the social appropriateness of the 16 robot actions when viewing the scene. We collected 15 different judgments per scene, and we also asked annotators to give a reason for why they answered as they did. These are the actions we have looked at. As you can see, we look at 16 actions, but many of them are the same, executed in different ways. We look at vacuum cleaning, mopping the floor, carry warm food, carry cold food, carry drinks, carry big objects, carry small objects, cleaning, and starting conversation, separated into two different groups of whether the action is executed within a circle or in the direction of an arrow. These actions were chosen because they vary in intrusiveness and they also are relevant for a home scenario and a domestic robot. The continual learning approach we use is an extension of Ebrahimi et al.'s work on uncertainty-guided continual learning with Bayesian neural networks. Basically, Ebrahimi et al.'s method utilizes the inherent uncertainty in the weights of a Bayesian neural network to tune the per-parameter learning rate such that parameters or learning weights that are important for previous knowledge are updated less when new knowledge arrives or new data arrives. Using this method, we propose 3 different models. We have a baseline with no continual learning. We have a 2 tasks model, which separates the 16 tasks in 2 groups. So it first trains on the 8 first actions and learns the social appropriateness of those actions, given different social contexts, before receiving data for the next 8 actions and doing the same. Finally, we have a 16 tasks model that learns the social appropriateness for each of the 16 actions incrementally. If we take a look at the data from the dataset, we can provide some interesting insight. For example, when looking at features as number of people in the room, number of people in a group, whether the robot is within a group or whether the robot is facing a group, we see that intrusive actions such as vacuum cleaning, mopping the floor, or carry big objects show a negative correlation relationship with social appropriateness, meaning that it's deemed less appropriate to do these actions when there's a lot of people in the room, the robot is standing within the group, or when the robot is facing the group. They're basically deemed too intrusive for that. On the other hand, actions like starting conversation is deemed to be appropriate when the robot is standing within the group or when the robot is facing a group. We also see that the distance to the group is relevant for the appropriateness of the different actions, that it is less appropriate to start a conversation if the robot is far from a group, and it's more appropriate to start to do intrusive actions when the robot is far from a group. We could look further into the distance features and see the same relationship here. If you look at distance to the closest human, distance to the second closest human, or distance to the third closest human, we see that the intrusive actions are deemed to be more appropriate when executed further away. On the other hand, starting conversation is deemed less appropriate as the distance from the people or the humans are increasing. Let's take a look at the results. What you see here is the training process, the continual learning process for the 16-task model. So we plot the loss on each action as the root mean squared error between the predicted appropriateness label and the actual average appropriateness label given from the annotators. And what we see is that when an action is trained on, a task, as we call it, the loss drops for that action, and it stays low throughout the continual learning process, meaning that the catastrophic forgetting, basically making sure we don't forget previous knowledge or how socially appropriate actions we previously trained on is successful and satisfactory. We also report average root mean square error on the entire test set for the 16-task model of 0.63. So this is the root mean squared error between the predicted appropriateness labels from the model and the actual average appropriateness label from the annotators. So remember, from a scale from 1 to 5, 0.63 is quite satisfactory. Let's also take a look at the test scene from the unseen data in the test set. What you see here is a social context in the living room where the robot is standing within a group of people quite close to all the people around it. We also see an animal in the room and someone standing on the other side of the sofa. Below in the table, we see the actual label provided by the annotators, average over 15 annotators for this scene, along with the predictions from the 3 different models, our baseline model, the 2 tasks model, and the 16-task model. We see similar behavior or information as in the correlation tables. For example, intrusive actions such as vacuum cleaning, mopping the floor, or carrying big objects are both predicted and labeled by the annotators to be quite inappropriate in this scenario and this social context. On the other hand, starting a conversation when the robot is standing so close to the people within the group and facing the closest human are deemed appropriate both by the models and the annotators. To conclude, we presented a data set where we explore the social appropriateness of our domestic robots' actions. This data set provides new insight in appropriate behavior for socially interactive robots in a home scenario. Using the data set, we present a Bayesian continual learning framework which models socially appropriate robot behavior and allows it to continuously update its knowledge about social appropriateness and social appropriate actions without forgetting what it already knows. Thank you.
Any questions? Okay, there's one. What kind of inputs does the model get? Does it try to figure out the group setting from the images directly?
So currently we provide all these variables, measurements, the distances to the humans and the orientation, etc., as measured. And we don't directly provide images as input. And in the future work, that is actually our goal. I mean, we are trying to extend the work such that we can directly provide the images and somehow estimate all the relevant information for this problem from the images.
Any other questions? Maybe we should move on because we had a delay anyway.
Yeah. So the next paper is titled "Can Expressive Posterior Approximations Improve Variational Continual Learning?" It's from Sayant and Audi, Jacob Hollenstein, Matteo Saveriano, Antonio Rodriguez Sanchez, and Justus Piater. Let me share my screen.
Hello everyone, I'm Shanthan and I will be talking about our recent work in which we investigated whether expressive posterior approximations can improve the performance of variational continual learning. Variational continual learning takes advantage of the fact that approximate Bayesian inference provides this very general framework for continual learning. So starting with a prior distribution over the parameters of a Bayesian neural network, that's PW, after learning task 1, that's after seeing the dataset D1, what we end up with is the posterior distribution over W, that's the parameters given the first task. And when we move on to learning the second task, we can treat the posterior that's learned after task 1 as the prior for task 2. And we have access to the dataset D2 for task 2, and we can use these two things in order to learn the posterior distribution PW given D1 and D2. And we can continue in the same way for subsequent tasks. And at the end, what we will end up with is the posterior distribution over the parameters given all the tasks. Variational continual learning uses the mean field variational inference approach, where we assume, we consider this approximate distribution Q5, which we assume to be a diagonal Gaussian distribution. And the ultimate aim is to make this approximate distribution as close as possible to the true posterior distribution. So one obvious thing that is evident here is that if the true posterior distribution is very complex, it can have multiple modes, for example, then it might be very difficult for a simple diagonal Gaussian distribution to closely approximate the true posterior distribution. There are many alternatives to mean field VI, such as using mixture models or implicit distributions, but the focus of this talk will be normalizing flows. The basic idea of a normalizing flow is that it takes samples generated from a very simple distribution, such as a Gaussian, as in this image here, and it converts it to a sample from a much more complex distribution by passing this data through a sequence of bijective functions. Variational inference has also been used together with normalizing flows, and it has been shown that for latent variable models such as variational autoencoders, this performs better than using the mean field approach for variational inference. But when we want to use normalizing flows with Bayesian neural networks, it's a little more complicated because the dimensionality of the parameters of a Bayesian neural network is very high. So the authors of the multiplicative normalizing flows paper get around this by using a sort of approximation for a normalizing flow. What they do is they start off with a vector z, which is of a much lower dimension than the network parameters, and they sample z0 from a Gaussian distribution. Then they pass this vector through a normalizing flow and obtain a sample Z, which comes from a much more complex distribution. This vector Z is then used as a mixing term in this conditional approximate distribution of the posterior, which ultimately is used to yield a sample of network parameters. So for a fully connected layer of a Bayesian neural network, this conditional distribution is given by this Gaussian, where Zi is an element of the vector Z here. In MNF, multiplicative normalizing flows, this is the evidence row bound, the objective that is maximized. And we are particularly interested in this term shown in blue, which involves the use of the approximate posterior as well as the prior. And note that the approximate conditional posterior is given by this expression. So we note that we can rewrite the KL divergence between two normal distributions in this way. And then we use the fact that we can use the posterior distribution from the previous network as the prior, in place of the prior, for learning a given task, right? So what we do is we replace PW in this expression by Q phi of old, and then we rewrite using the previous expression and end up with an expression for the KL divergence that we use for training our network for continual learning. So to summarize, this shows the learnable parameters of one layer, both for mean field on the left and normalizing flows on the right. So we see that for normalizing flows, in addition to the mean and standard deviation parameters for the network weights, we also have additional parameters for the normalizing flow, as well as the mean and standard deviation parameters for the initial mixing terms Z0. We performed experiments using the permitted MNIST benchmark and used 10 tasks. We used a train validation test split of 50,000, 10,000, and 10,000, and we used networks with 3 hidden layers, each of which had 200 units with ReLU activations. So this figure shows the mean test accuracy. So that means that suppose when a network is trained on task 4, it calculates, after being trained, it calculates the test accuracies on task 4, 3, 2, 1, and 0. So all tasks current and everything that came before it. So for 10 epochs, we see that mean field performs better than normalizing flows, but as we increase the number of training epochs, first of all, for 50, they are quite the same, but for 100, normalizing flows performs better. But we can also see that as we increase the number of epochs, the overall performance degrades. But this mean accuracy does not give us the whole picture. So for example, for 10 epochs, we can see here that the performance of both the kind of networks are dominated by the performance on the very first task that is learned. So it can be seen that for later tasks, the networks face a lot of problem in learning them, right? So the first task is remembered well, the later tasks are not remembered or not learned very well. But this trend reverses when we move on to 50 or 100 epochs. So for 50 and 100 epochs, we see that the older tasks are forgotten faster and the newer tasks are remembered quite well. When we look at the case for 100 epochs, we see that up to task for task 0, 1, and 2, the performance for both the mean field and the normalizing flows is quite similar. But for the later tasks, that's from task 3 onwards, there's quite a big gap in the performance of normalizing flows and mean field. So normalizing flows performs much better in remembering more recent tasks. So this gives us an indication that normalizing flows may have this ability of gracefully forgetting old tasks, and this might be a capability that is desirable in certain circumstances where it is not necessary to remember everything from the past as the network learns more and more tasks, right? So given the kind of setup that we use here, we do not store any kind of sample data from the different data sets that the network encounters, nor do we have any kind of parameter growth. So we use a constant network capacity. And so if these are our constraints, then this thing might actually be a desirable quality. But to conclude, we see that in general, for permuted MNIST, the performance of mean field and normalizing flows is pretty comparable, but with more epochs, normalizing flows gets better than mean field. And there is also a slight indication of this graceful forgetting property. But we realize that a lot more investigation is needed in order to confirm this, and we will be conducting future experiments on complex data sets such as Core50 or CFAR. And we will also be looking at more complex, at alternative VI techniques such as implicit variational inference. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you. Sayantan is here with us. Sayantan, can you hear us?
Yeah, you can hear me?
Yeah. So, do we have any questions for you? Okay, we don't have any questions. If you have any questions, please type your questions in the chat box. In the meantime, maybe we can start chatting with Sayantan. Can you talk a little bit about the computational burden or extra computation burden that you get from normalizing flows in terms of number of parameters and training time?
Yes, so normalizing flows have quite a bit of more parameters than if you use the mean field. So I think in this experiment, we had in each layer, the normalizing flows have two very small neural network layers in order to build this normalizing flow, right? So that adds quite a bit. And especially for something as small as permuted MNIST, it does not, the benefit is not very visible, right? In terms of computational time, it's about double, I would say, for training. So yeah, I mean, for a small data set like permuted MNIST, it's not evident at all that this extra parameter size and computational time pays off. But you know, for bigger data sets, this might lead to better performance. So
yeah. Okay, so we have one question in the chat box from Ali. He's saying that he has a couple of questions. The first one is, if forgetting is desirable, why not do fine-tuning and let the model forget previous tasks? The first one. The second one is also, do you provide task labels during testing? Because in the real-world scenarios, you don't have the task labels available.
Okay, so for the first question, if I just do fine-tuning, then I'm completely eliminating any form of continual learning, right? So if I keep on fine-tuning till the end, when I train for task 10, it is not supposed to remember anything from task 1 to 9. But with continual learning, there's this gradual fading away of the performance. So this, I don't think, can be achieved if I stick to fine-tuning. For the second question, in this particular experiment, permuted MNIST, for every task, the network is supposed to classify it into classify an image into 10 separate classes. So there is no task label involved here. It doesn't know that while testing which image came from which task.
Okay. Then there is another question. Maybe we can quickly answer that as well before we proceed with the next invited talk. Do you think the added parameters explains the late blossoming of the approaches with respect to the epochs needed?
Absolutely. So this was my initial assumption that since the size of the parameters is so much higher, maybe it needs a lot more epochs to learn something useful. And so with 10 epochs, it's not really doing anything useful compared to the mean field. So this is definitely possible, but I don't have a concrete proof that this happens. So I will be looking into it.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
So we will be now continuing with our second invited talk, and lucky for us, it will be live. So hopefully we will not encounter any technical difficulties. Welcome, Lola. So the next talk is by Lola Canamero, who is a reader in adaptive systems, and she's also the head of the Embodied Emotion, Cognition and Interaction Lab at the University of Hertfordshire. The research focuses on synthetic modeling of embodied affect in autonomous and social robots, and its interactions with embodied cognition. So over to you, Lola. If you share your screen, we can start.
Yeah. Okay. Apparently, the host has disabled attendee screen sharing.
So Sinan will need to help with that because officially he has been given access to be the host.
He's in charge.
Yes. Even though we asked for multiple accounts.
I mean, it worked. Yes, it should work.
You are muted, Sinan. So if you're saying something, maybe you should unmute so we can hear.
Sorry, Hatice, now you are the host because my Zoom had crashed, right? So in the
I see. Okay.
In the participants, you need to make Lola co-host.
Yeah. Okay, done.
Okay.
Can you try again?
Let's see. Yeah. That's the one.
Great.
Okay. Can everyone see it? Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. So yes, as Hatice said, my work is in modeling architectures, embodied architectures of affect, and we're going to see a little bit what that is. And for this talk, I'm going to focus on the role of this embodied affect, obviously in lifelong learning for human-robot interaction. So in the workshop, I mean, the perspective that this talk brings is with respect to this statement that lifelong learning is essential for social robots since it facilitates learning in concept situations. And so that robots can appropriately adapt their behavior to the social context. So I'm going to talk about how affect can ground all these aspects. But also how adaptive behavior develops in the social context. So it develops in the robot that is interacting with humans. And with respect to the challenges, I'm going to kind of address a little bit all of them from the perspective of developmental robotics and affective cognitive robotics. So a few words for those of you who are not familiar with this embodied approach. A few words on what I mean. So by embodied affect, I mean it's not just because I'm using robots or physical artifacts, but it really means that affect happens in and through the body, and that's a key aspect that I am modeling. So it's fundamentally embodied in two ways. Internally, there's a lot of things going on inside our body, and that's something that I simulate using homeostatically controlled physiology. I simulated physiology, hormones that that modulate different aspects of synthetic hormones, but also externally, facial and body expression are very important. And I take the perspective of embodied artificial intelligence, which means that I model the interaction dynamics of an embodied a creature situated in a context that is constantly changing, an environment where it is playing, has specific roles and has relations with other with other agents. It has very limited knowledge and perception of the world, so it knows very little. Intelligence is defined in terms of different perception action loops. So perception and action are intrinsically linked and influence each other. And there's many of these in parallel. And the intelligence is not just inside the robot, but it's in the interactions that the agents entertain with the environment. So all this is key for learning, obviously. But in learning and in general, we are not looking for optimization, but to keep this agent viable for it to survive and be able to adapt. So now what I mean by affect, so I mean two things that we can very intuitively define as the wanting and the liking. So one is, the wanting will be like motivation for action, but also for cognition, like curiosity, and for interactions and social needs. And the liking, the emotion aspect is liking or disliking these things, what we do, what we perceive, what we know, how we do it, and the consequences of what we do as well. So these things really are key because they define what matters to us, but also to robots, and they're like a driving force for cognition, but also for social interaction. So as I mentioned, affect and cognition are deeply linked, and I like to talk about affective cognition. So affect colors cognition, modulates cognition, and cognition is also part of our emotions. There is also an aspect that is key for learning, specifically, well, for other things, but for learning, is that affect provides very useful information to learn things about the world and our interactions with it. For example, valence dimension of emotions, so the positive or qualitative or negative quality, gives information about the value of things, and arousal about the urgency or importance of different things. So I can see kind of emotions as different functioning modes of the nervous system. So same structure works in different ways, and is reconfigured slightly different, under different emotional states. So this kind of core, very simple model of affect, well, simple in a way, is grounds in both in biological agents, but also in robots, a bunch of notions that are key in autonomous robots, but also in for agents in general, like autonomy, adaptation, interaction, learning, development, and evolution. And let's see some of those. So some of the roles that affect play in lifelong learning and long-term interactions. So one of them key is provide motivation for learning and interaction. So affect makes us wanting to learn and to interact. So it's related to needs, but can be cognitive or social needs as well. So, and not just survival related. Also, a key aspect are affective bonds and attachment, and we're gonna focus quite substantially on this in the talk. So affective bonds with the caregivers and attachment to caregivers in early in life guide a bunch of things. So attention, what's important, the interactions that we're going to have, what we are going to see, what we're going to learn about, how by observing caregivers, imitating them, and many of these features carry over in adult life. Lifelong learning can also be seen as development, the way we develop. So it's not just learning about things, but it's also how the cognitive system and the affective system grow and change and develop. So, this affect guides how we grow and change through life, not just in infancy. Learning from affective interaction and affective feedback is also key to develop social robots. So some sort of unsupervised learning, so to speak. And this affect is key to learn to regulate our emotions and social responses in how our emotional intelligence develops. And these are very fundamental aspects in development and learning, and later in social interaction and relationships through life. Okay, let's very quickly see what I mean about some of these things. Okay, so with respect to autonomy, we have like a very simple caricature of the main types of decision-making systems. So, the simplest one is a reactive system. There's a stimulus and there's a response. The agent just responds every time the stimulus appears. But when affect comes into play, then things get a little bit more interesting and complex. So motivations is, related to needs, and this wanting means that agents are going to start making decisions based on internal needs, not just on what's happening in the environment. So there's going to be an interaction between the internal needs, what's happening, and that is going to involve more complex cognitive capabilities as well, like looking for things or learning what things are, how to get them. And we add another layer related to emotion, and in this case we have a more complex behavior, because we're talking here about adaptive mechanisms to respond to situations that are key for survival, for social interaction, etc. So it's a way also of changing priorities. So how can we, model these things in robots? So related to autonomy, the wanting, a very simple model is, for example, taking a cybernetics approach and modeling needs in terms of variables that have to be kept within a range of permissible values. Like, for example, here, a robot has a level of energy that has to be kept within boundaries, and there's an ideal value and there's an actual value, and the difference produces an error, a deficit. Okay, so that's an internal signal. And then we have in the environment elements that permit to satisfy that need. So combining these two things, we model motivation. And this is a simple model taken from ethology, so study of animals in their natural environment. So there are different ways of putting this in mathematical formula. So this is a very sensible one to use that we have taken from specific works from ethology. So a motivation is going to combine the internal deficit and this external stimulus in that way. Now, how do we model the liking? So related to that very simple model, the simplest model of element of emotion could be related to pleasure, how needs are satisfied. So we have this physiological space. Here, the different internal variables that an agent can have. In the center, we'll have the ideal values of these variables. And here we have like the limits, the lethal boundaries. If the values, the actual values go beyond those boundaries, the robot is gonna die. So we could define simple pleasure in terms of things that correct those values towards towards their ideal value, and pain or displeasure are things that take it away. So this can be simulated, and this can be programming robots by, for example, using a simulated hormone that is released as a function of this, and interacts with the cognitive mechanisms of the robot, for example, with the attention or with perception. So an example is here. If we go back to the previous example, we could, for example, have this the level of pleasure affect the perception, how the stimulus is perceived, the salience, for example, which is something that actually happens, in biological emotions. So you pay attention to different things in different ways. In a state of fear, some of the elements of the external environment are going to be very, very salient, etc. So, this is a way we introduce this parameter in the formula, and the value of this parameter is going to be modulated by, that hormone that was released as a function of pleasure, as an example. So that, to give you an idea of the basic mechanisms. Okay. So, what happens here is that modulation is going to affect, for example, how, as I said, how the external stimuli are going to be perceived, in this architecture, or how some of the sensors work. Just as an example, as I said. Okay, so these signals can be used to in learning, long life or not, to produce signals for learning. So, for example, one of my former students, Ignacy Cost, he coupled this kind of system with reinforcement learning and actor-critic algorithm to learn affordances of objects. So a little Caregiver robot that was moving around the environment and had to learn what were graspable things that it could lift and could perhaps provide, be a metaphor for providing energy sources or something like that. So through the interactions with the different objects, that were provided different affordances to the robot, different opportunities for interaction. Those whatever the robot was doing would affect the the values of the internal variables. So would replenish energy, or would do other things, change those values. That would produce different errors, correct the errors, augment the errors, etc., etc. And at the same time, the actions of the robot would change the sensory input. So, all these elements were used as signals for kind of unsupervised learning to learn, what the different actions that the robot was doing with the objects. So what those different objects afforded in terms of satisfying the needs of the robot. So that's an example. And this is using the, the pleasure dimension of emotions. If we take the arousal dimension, there's a bunch of things that affect can allow us to learn. For example, here, this was using a, a neural network that had, we also had a variable parameter to measure arousal. That was kind of the level of activity of the network as a function of the novelty of what was perceived. So, for example, here, a very predictable environment with the human caregiver that is, safe, would produce low arousal. So that's, nothing to worry about. Other scenes with, medium level arousal, like things that were novel, but not too novel and were somehow predictable. So the robot could kind of manage that. And other, areas in the room with, would produce kind of stress, high arousal, because they were quite unpredictable. So they were very novel, which was kind of good, but at the same time, very unpredictable. So this, arousal parameter would affect also some elements of the neural network underlying this architecture, like, for example, the learning rate or different things that can be modulated. So, a robot moving around a room could affect, learn, which would be good places to go to in different situations, which places to avoid, with this affective input. I kind of I'm not sure. I think I started at 10:30 or a bit earlier.
I think it was around 25.
It was around 25. Okay.
I think so. Yes.
Okay. So let's focus now on the lifelong aspects, and I want to talk about development. And specifically about attachment and how social bonds can can provide a grounding for this learning. So we humans are social mammals, and share many features with other mammal species. So we affiliate and we have attachment bonds between infants and caregivers, and we can define attachment as a kind of drive, internal need to maintain proximity and accessibility to a caregiver. As I said, it's shared. And actually, in non-human primates, the system is very, very similar to ours. And you might think that children. Well, there was a theory, in the 70s that this was, of course, related to reinforcement learning. So children stick to their to the caregivers because they provide food and they provide good things. But there was an experiment you might have heard that Harlow in the late 50s carried out with rhesus monkeys, I think. So they that were orphaned, and so they had two surrogate mothers. This one very and when an iron, like a metal structure that was not nice to touch, but provided food. And a nice one, a comfy one with some nice fabric, where the baby could go and rest and just seek comfort. So now, what happens when the baby was hungry? Would go here. When he was tired, would go to the other mother. But when he was stressed and encountered a problem, he would not go to the one that provided food. He would go to the comfy one. He would seek comfort. So comfort and well-being are key in this attachment. Bonds. So how to bootstrap these bonds, how to model them, how to bootstrap them. So let's look at what happens, one of the phenomena that happens in nature. So even in other animals like birds, you can observe something related, that is imprinting. So Konrad Lorenz, in the ornithologist in the 30s, he did studies where he's followed by all these geese. So birds follow the first thing they see. Basically, they see, and if it moves, they just go and follow. They try to keep the first perception they have. So usually they get imprinted to a mother, but it can be, unnaturally imprinted to other things that happen to be there when they hatch, like ornithologists, for example. And this can be, used for to model these bonds in robots using the same kind of, homeostatic control of perception. In this case, we're going to see. Okay, so it is important, an important mechanism, because the imprinted object is treated like a caregiver, gives rise to affiliative behaviors like approach and following, which has evolutionary advantages, because you follow someone who is going to look after you, and you learn lots of things. You're safe, you get help. They facilitate learning and social learning, etc. So here we have our imprinted robot. Just got imprinted to that guy. It's just an infrared sensor, so it's imprinted to a distance. In fact, the distance that it saw at the beginning when it hatched. Okay, so goes on like that. But of course, that is just the initial step. And you want more complex things building from that, and you want the robot to learn, for example, to learn to accept different distances. That's what happens, here. The robot is kind of scared of other distances. It's going to try to maintain the distance that it learned, and is going to, go back when something approaches too much, so it can be dangerous. But adding some elements of learning through comfort, for example, tactile comfort, that the robot is trying to keep high, because it's providing a good signal. The caregiver can teach the robot to learn other distances. Other distances are acceptable. You know, when the robot has the need to, you know, for more tactile contact or to look for novelty, it's going to then start exploring and seeking for more. I don't know, you can, yeah. So it's going to seek for, you know, look for that nice stimulus, etc. So, you know, a caregiver can guide the learning of different types of distances. Different things are good. You know, I'm comforting you. It's okay. You learn it. You know, in a good affective state, it can even start doing, you know, when it's in a good affective state of well-being, it can start exploring things. And as we see here, an imitation game, instead of trying to maintain the distance, is actually trying to imitate what is perceiving. So starts playing little games. Okay, so you know, what has been added here is, well, a bunch of mechanisms. So the interaction is going to be driven by comfort and distress responses in the robots. But they, you know, we added different mechanisms for adaptational learning. So learning, for example, times, so to change the learning rates, you know, over time to accommodate for some, you know, learning new experiences without, you know, forgetting the previous ones, and not being too, you know, consolidate the learning, but still allow for some learning, and have, you know, different things that have been learned and the different states of well-being. All of them remember at different time scales that then could be retrieved as a function of the well-being level of the robot. So it's something a bit similar to like this mood congruent recall phenomenon. Okay, so this provides the right balance between exploration and exploitation in the robot, depending on the affective state. So let's now see a couple of other important features of attachment. So the caregiver is going to provide a secure base for the infant to explore or the robot to explore the world safely and return in case of problems. But the bond is a key feature, is the calming influence of the attachment figure in the infant. So this influence is going to be mediated through social interactions that can be of different types, distal or proximal, and different types of interaction, different caregiver profiles is going to affect the development of the infant in different ways and the learning. But there is no universal, you know, gold standard regarding a caregiving style is going to produce this profile, and this is the, you know, the good way to achieve this, because all this, you know, depends on many factors like the features of the infant, the strategies to regulate stress, but also society and culture. So let's see some examples. This is work by Kim Bard, collaborator, psychologist. So for example, in you know, Western cultures, we're used to, this is at UK, we're used to things like this. So you know, interactions are mediated using objects that are kind of distal. In other cultures, you know, they're very embodied, you know, like involve dancing, moving, etc. So, you know, they can be very different. I said they're very, you know, similar in on non-human primates. So in this case, so we see chimpanzees, they're in an enclosure and they're actually hanging very, very high. You might think that the mother is just not paying attention to what the baby is. No, it is, but you know, she's paying attention, but what happens is that her peripheral vision is really good. Her arms are very long, they're very strong, and the babies are very strong as well. So she's absolutely paying attention, but in a different way. And if anything happens, she will have no problem to grab the baby. But, you know, we might think it's very different, but it's not actually. So as I said, you know, one of the features is of attachment is that a baby in a stressful situation will seek the secure base of the parent, but it can happen per species. So what happens here, that's mommy. The baby was left with a stranger here. It was a bit wary, so it was, you know, moving around. But then mommy entered, and mommy happened to be, you know, a psychologist, and okay, went to the mom. In a good case of a secure attachment, as they go. Okay, so let's see what happens in learning. So we have here, you know, a robot that has to learn the objects in a new environment that hasn't seen before. So the colors, textures, features of these objects here. And well, it has a neural network, and again, this arousal parameters. So novelty produces arousal that can be, you know, good or too high. It modulates the learning rate. So here we have a caregiver that is very attentive and is, you know, calming. That calming effect is calming the robot when it's aroused by, you know, touching its senses or showing the face. Okay, and here we have a caregiver that thinks that, you know, the robot should be a bit more independent and learn by itself. So it's going to bootstrap the learning of the robot at the beginning, and then it's going to leave the robot to learn on its own. So what happened here is that the learning is going to be very different. So in this environment, this robot is going to learn much faster because of the calming influence of the caregiver is going to affect the learning rate. So it's going to, you know, let it learn the novel objects more quickly. This robot here is going to take longer, but it's going to have to develop, you know, over time, the arousal will go down. So it will, you know, have to use that natural decrease of the arousal to learn. However, when we put this robot in another environment and this robot in another environment, this one is going to learn the new environment faster than this one, because it had to develop this strategy to self-regulate the arousal level, whereas this other one needs the, you know, the support of the caregiver for longer. So it really depends, you know, there's no golden standard, and you see how different profiles of caregiving can affect learning, but, you know, in some cases, one can be good, you know, better than the other. It depends on the context. Okay, I am a bit long, so I'm going to skip this. I'm just going to show another, you know, I've been talking about hormones that, you know, modulate architectures, different types of architectures. So we're going to add another layer of modulation here. So in the same case of a, you know, a robot developing with caregivers, we have now what we call epigenetic adaptation. And what happens here is that the neural network, basically there's another you know, layer of hormones that is going to regulate the secretion somehow of the first level of hormones, and providing a you know, interplay between positive and negative feedback loops. And well, this is inspired from the role of you know, cortisol and testosterone, so stress hormones. Okay, so let's see what happens here. So, you know, the robot has same internal variables that had to be controlled hemostatically: energy, health, temperature, and hormones that signal for errors in these ones, and also this other, you know, epigenetic mechanism consisting of other hormones. So what this is going to produce is the, you know, the architecture of the robot is going to develop differently as a function of the sensory motor interactions of the robot and the caregiver. So let's see here a case of a robot developing with a hostile caregiver. So hostile because, you know, it's not letting the robot explore, is very rough handling, is you know, preventing it from acquiring new experiences, doesn't give the neural network time to, you know, to converge, etc. Okay, so what happens here is that the robot is going to, develop a very, what is called avoidant profile. It's going to avoid the caregiver, which for it is a pattern of, movement around the senses and stimulation of the sensors. It's going to stay near a nice area that doesn't move, the wall here. So it's going to avoid, basically. Oops. So now let's see. Oops, sorry. What happens with a conscientious and attentive caregiver that is going to stimulate, the sensors carefully at the right, speed, making sure that all the areas get stimulation, that the robot acquires, like a balanced range of experiences, etc., etc. So exposing the robot to different textures. And what happens here is that the robot is going to try and reproduce those nice experiences. So in this case, it's trying to get the attention of the caregiver to get more of that nice stimulation. So develops a very, what to us looks like a very playful, a very playful behavioral phenotype. And it's, once more stimulation, once more novelty, whereas the other was avoiding novelty. Okay, so you get the idea. Just to show, the kind of underlying mechanism. So what happens here is that the hidden layer of the neural network is grows. So nodes form through associations between, different inputs from the different senses and the hormones, etc., etc. So this layer grows, and okay, this is so an example. Here we see, same initial architecture. So this is kind of the an example of the network, the internal layer that develops for a robot that was left without the possibility to move. So sensory deprived environments, a very poor, architecture, like in a more standard environment where the robot could explore a bit more, richer network. In a very novel environment with a, a very conscientious caregiver, you get a much richer one. And if you keep exposing the robot to, the same experiences, you start seeing some differentiation that could be associated with different objects. So the cognitive development of the robot is also, much richer as a function of this, caregiver that is helping and this, exposing the robot and allowing for rich sensory motor experiences. Okay, so well, just to conclude, I think affect is fundamental in bootstrapping and then guiding learning through life. And I'd just like to conclude with some questions, because we have to, think about the meaning of replicability of experiments. Of course, we have to, be able to replicate, but we're not. Robots are learning from kind of very unique experiences. So what does it mean to, reproducibility? What does it mean in this case? Also, how do we choose a good caregiver for the robot, that develops the robot, help develop the robots with the appropriate and ethical values? So just, to questions that perhaps we could ponder. So I would just like to, thank the collaborators in my lab, past and present, and funding bodies, and to all of you for your attention. And I'm being a bit long, I'm afraid. Sorry.
Thank you very much. Well, that's okay. We'll try to catch up somehow. Thank you very much. So this was very informative, providing a completely different perspective from the first keynote. And I'm sure third keynote will be also different. So really includes and contributes to the richness of the workshop. We already have a question. So Ali Ayub says, thank you for an interesting talk. I wanted to ask, for learning objects through novelty, did you try it in more complex environments with realistic or household objects? or tested in a novel environment different from the training environment?
Yes. Okay. So we'll in this, you know, this kind of thing. What you see here is actually the office environment. So we let the robot in the office with objects such as plastic bottles, which are really difficult to detect. You know, cans. In other cases, we put you know, all sort of objects that the robot had to go underneath the table. So it was really a real world environment with all sort of objects, not just this. So, you know, there will be the backpack of the student there, or, you know, other, let me see, a video that I did not show, but here, this is an example of another environment. Oh, I am not sharing the, sorry, I'm pointing and I'm not sharing the screen. Okay, so sorry, can I, let me see if I can share the screen again.
Your screen is shared. I think you just have to
put
it
share, okay. Oh, sorry, yes.
Yeah, if you want,
okay.
You can put it in presentation mode so it becomes a full screen.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, so things like this, you know, with like toys, and here, you know, for the purpose of the video, we have very bright colors, but, you know, the robot is actually paying attention to very low level features. So it could be, you know, we would have like drawings of faces hanging from the walls and pictures, and the robot would detect some features of those and take it for a face, for example. So the robot is paying attention, is working with, you know, features that can be found across different types of objects. So it's more that rather than the object. And that means that, you know, it's going to be able to generalize somehow more easily rather than, you know, the specific object. So it's not learning, oh, this is the object, but it's more, oh, I can use the object for this, or I can, oh, that looks like a face, I'm going to interact with it. Sometimes it's a person, sometimes it's a drawing, and both will have functions within the, you know, the environment of the robot. For example, going to a drawing means that if the robot was playing with the person is going to be after the robot. If the person wants to keep playing, the robot is playing with, you know, the picture, which from outside will look like the robot is actually understanding the picture. No, it's not. It just thinks that it has detected a face, but creates a dynamics in the person that means that it's going to start handling the robot in different ways, trying to get the attention of the robot. You know, so it's going to create different interactions. So I'm not so much interested in, oh, this specific robot, but it's the opportunities that the environment provides for the robot to have different experiences and sometimes engage with the wrong object, but in an interesting way. I don't know if that answers the question.
Ali, is that okay in terms of answer, or do you have another question? You can type it if it's not clear. Okay, I'm not seeing anything. Sinan, do you have any questions? I'm so familiar with Lola's work because she has also given kindly invited lectures for my course. I don't have a lot of questions, so perhaps Sinan has any some questions.
Yeah, thank you, Lola, for this nice talk. I have one question regarding the last bit that you mentioned, reproducibility and replicability. This is an important challenge for lifelong learning robots because they are developing in different environments. So in recent years have allowed robotic researchers to use advanced simulation environments to benchmark their methods, and now I think these things are becoming more and more common. Do you think such simulation environments can be used for these purposes?
Yes, so I think it is very different, very, very important, you know, this benchmarking and contributing to standards. But I think we have to think of it and really think carefully of what they key properties are. So for example, if we want to study attachment, so which are the key features of the environment, how we embody them, or of the phenomenon, how do we embody those in the environment, how we study the relations. Now, having like a standard environment is also important. So I have used, for example, in developmental robotics, there is an environment that has been used very much is play mats with toys, to develop so have some sort of standard environment. Yes, but it's really understanding how to, the features of what we want to study and how the environment reflects those. But we had to be, I think, in this kind of work, very careful about not restricting things too much and leave the door open, to define new environments, to deviate from the standard as well. Because in this case, cases like this, robots are learning from one experience. That experience could be unique in the real world. What the robot is perceiving might be not found again exactly the same, and the robot will develop a behavior that is slightly different to respond to the same kind of world conditions, but it will respond in a slightly different way. So replicability is going to be something different. We have to still aim for replicability, but we have to think what that means and how to measure it. It's not going to be this statistical kind of analysis of what's happened. It has to be also trying to understand what that unique experience led to. So for example, things like this, so these networks are going to be different every time, but what we still can try and associate, a link, how the network develops with, a careful study of what's going on in terms of types of sensory experiences, type of this, the internal dynamics, etc., etc. So yes, all those issues are key, but we have to think of them in slightly different ways.
Thank you.
I don't see any other questions, so I think we can conclude here with Lola's talk. Lola, thank you very much. Particularly the live aspect of it has contributed as well a lot. So thanks for your time and contribution.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. So Sinan, I would suggest not to have a break because we are slightly behind schedule, and I'm not sure in the system if 12:45 they're going to disable or not. I don't really know how the underlying system works.
Yeah.
So I would suggest to continue with the next. I think Vincenzo is online with us.
Yeah, he's with us. We will play his video. Then he will be able to answer questions. So let me share my screen. I hope this time it doesn't crash in between. Our third invited talk is from Vincenzo Monaco on continual learning, neuroscience, and robotics, and intertwined destiny. Vincenzo is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Bologna, working on neuroscience-inspired AI and continual learning. He is also the president of Continual AI, a platform for endorsing research and activities related to continual learning. His main research interests include open science and ethical AI developments, continual and lifelong learning with deep architectures, multitask learning, knowledge distillation and transfer, and their applications to embedded systems, robotics, and Internet of Things. So let me play the video.
Hi, my name is Vincenzo Monaco, and today I'm going to talk about continual learning, neuroscience, and robotics, and how these three fields can come together to help us design better continual learning algorithms. Before starting, let me just spam a few more words about myself. For those who don't know me, I am a continual learning postdoc at the University of Bologna. and I'm also the co-founder, president, and director of research at Continual AI, a non-profit organization working on continual learning and AI. I'm also involved in some teaching activities in my university for the machine learning and computer architectures courses, and I've been the author and technical reviewer of the online course Deep Learning with R and the book R Deep Learning Essentials, respectively. Finally, I'm also the co-founder and board member of AI for People. Of course, if you want to learn more about myself, you can check out my website, vincenzolomonaco.com. So all the works I'm going to present today are the result of a fruitful collaboration of many people, especially the Continual Learning at Biolab unit at the University of Bologna, coordinated by Professor Davide Maltoni, and with the great effort of two brilliant PhD students, Lorenzo Pellegrini and Gabriele Graffieti. Great, so let's start with a brief introduction to Continual Learning, especially for those of you that are not really familiar with it, maybe coming from a robotics background. Continual Learning is based on the very simple yet powerful idea to never stop learning. So it's the only machine learning paradigm that does deal with an higher and more realistic timescale where data and tasks become available only during time. So we acknowledge the fact that we will never be able to create a perfect model of the world one shot, and that we need to constantly update our biased understanding of the external world over time to face ever-changing environments and novel circumstances. So one key property of every continual learning algorithm is to not have access to previously encountered data. And this in turn let us be constant in terms of computational and memory resources that we deploy to our system, while still being able to incrementally develop even more complex knowledge and skills. However, learning continually is very complex for both artificial learning systems as well as biological learning ones, for what it's known as the stability plasticity dilemma. Essentially, it's very complex to find a trade-off between remembering past concepts as well as learning new concepts and generalize over time, that is getting rid only of the biased information that we have in favor of the more general and robust one. But for deep learning and neural networks in general trained with stochastic gradient descent, one of the first problems that we encounter is catastrophic forgetting. That is, we are too plastic. We learn very quickly from the new data we encounter, and we suddenly erase all the knowledge and skills we learned in the past. So over the last few years, we have witnessed growing interest in continual learning with deep architectures, and a number of continual learning algorithms have been proposed to tame the issue of forgetting. Those algorithms are based on different approaches: the regularization, the rehearsal, the generative replay, and architectural approaches. So I invite you to check out our latest survey on continual learning that you can find at the bottom of this slide. You will find more information about state-of-the-art algorithms and heuristic to tame forgetting and design better continual learning algorithms. All right, so we have made a lot of progress in continual learning over the last few years, but now we can ask ourselves how we can move forward. And what I believe is that we can learn a lot from biological learning algorithms, as well as from recent neuroscience discoveries. So let's focus on this slide for a moment, where I try to plot different AI approaches we have been developing over time as the AI community with two different axes: the neuroscience grounding on the x-axis and the practical functionality of these approaches on the y-axis. And even if you focus on just neural networks approaches, the red dots on the slide, you can see that we have made a lot of progress over the last few decades. Just by using neuroscience insights, moving from simple feed-forward neural networks to convolutional neural networks and then deep convolutional neural networks, all based on evidence from the visual cortex, and then being able to integrate into a single representation both time and space with convolutional LSTMs. And we have done the same again with deep reinforcement learning, reducing essentially the amount of supervision that we give to our systems. And I think the same can happen with continual learning to move our AI system the next step forward. And we can learn a lot from neuroscience also for continual learning algorithms themselves. For example, we know that the brain employs several mechanisms for learning continually, starting from replaying memory traces to modulating learning through synaptic plasticity, as well as using neurogenesis, that is trying to create new synapses for encoding new information. We also know that it uses highly sparse and distributed representation, and that's of course help taming, forgetting, and interference of different knowledge. And we also know that it works on high-dimensional and supervised data sequences, so we better make sure to develop our algorithms so they can work in the same regime with this kind of data. But what we don't know is how efficiently implement each of those mechanisms into artificial learning systems, and what is their relative importance and how they interplay among each other. But neuroscience is not the only field that can help us design better continual learning algorithms. And I think that robotic systems also offer a very nice opportunity to work on realistic test beds for efficient and scalable continual learning systems. Robotics, for example, let us design better continual learning algorithms that can work within an embodiment framework, that is, agents that can act on the world and explore its hidden relationships autonomously. Then it helps us work under realistic constraints and limitations of the physical world. For example, designing continual learning algorithms that can learn efficiently and with scalability in mind. They can work under realistic assumption of streaming data collection, and they work in mostly unsupervised settings. Finally, helping us avoiding to focus too much on toy problems. And in the end, robotics is very helpful for the real-world deployment of our AI systems for applications we truly care about. But neuroscience and robotics are not just two fields that can guide us into developing better continual learning algorithms. I believe these three fields are deeply connected, and we're going to see in the near future more and more transfer and cross-pollination among each other. This is because there are mutual benefits for all of these fields, not just for continual learning. For example, continual learning can benefit robotics in developing efficient, active, and adaptive learning algorithms that have been always at the core of many robotics applications. And continual learning can be seen also as the latest machine learning incarnation of developmental robotics. And the same happens in the relationships of continual learning with neuroscience, where continual learning can help neuroscience in providing useful test beds for computational neuroscience theories of learning and memories, of course, and then also better tools, AI tools developed through continual learning can let us better understand neuroscience data. To close the loop, also neuroscience and robotics share mutual benefits. Robotics for neuroscience can help, for example, in designing realistic test beds for behavioral and embodied neuroscience theories, as well as providing insights from applications into the perception, locomotion, and navigation realm. And conversely, neuroscience can help robotics in designing more efficient and integrated perception and control models, for example. So what I believe is that acknowledging the fact that these three different fields are converging towards a unique goal can help us design better priorities for our current research in continual learning. So for example, many techniques that have been proposed in the last few years in continual learning deal with the spurious multitask settings in which algorithms are often allowed to have access to additional task supervised signals, or it involves just a sequence of few and well-isolated big tasks from which to learn from, and the data belonging to each of those tasks is IID. So essentially avoiding the main problem of continual learning, that is trying to learn from a stream of non-ID data over time and in an efficient way. Then most of these algorithms are based on unrealistic and toy datasets that are useful to prototyping new continual learning strategies or understand some basic notions of it. But at the same time, they are unlikely to provide us real insight on how to proceed forward. And then all these algorithms have been mostly tried on mostly supervised settings with an overly focus on the accuracy metric. That is just one of the different axes of evaluation we should consider developing, truly continual learning agents. What I believe to be a better focus for continual learning research today is working under single incremental task scenarios. That is not involving necessarily multiple tasks, but learning from high-dimensional data streams I lean on AD data, for example, natural videos from realistic data sets, and possibly moving towards mostly unsupervised settings, exploiting, for example, time as a surrogate supervised signal. Then another important shift of our priorities will be focusing on scalability and efficiency rather than just accuracy. So having redefined our priorities, we can now design benchmarks and metrics that can help us move towards that direction. So we can now think at our continual learning setting as just a stream of perceptual data that we are allowed to process in small incremental batches. And based on the content of those batches, we can define three different scenarios. The new instances scenarios is based on examples that we encounter in these incremental batches that are belonging to classes we have already seen in the initial batch. For the new classes instead, what we encounter are new examples of classes we have never seen before. For the new instances and classes scenario, the most realistic one. What we encounter in each incremental batch are examples of classes we have already seen before, but also examples of new classes we have never seen before. Core 50 has been one of the first video benchmarks that we proposed back in 2017 and has been specifically designed for continual learning and to work under these scenarios. So providing different benchmarks for rapidly prototyping continual learning algorithms. And here you can see the 11 different sessions that we collected for 50 different domestic objects in very different environmental conditions, varying background, illumination, rotation, and occlusions, so that we could really assess the capability of a continual learning agent that can somehow learn over time invariances for those objects. But Core 50 is not the only dataset and benchmark you can use for continual learning, respecting the principles and the priorities we have defined before. For example, you can use Stream 51, which is a very interesting continual learning benchmark, using different videos recorded in very unconstrained environments. Then you can use the OpenLoris dataset, for example, in which you can assess your continual learning algorithms on a robotic environment instead. In fact, all the different video sessions of domestic objects, in this case, have been collected directly on a robotic platform. And then last but not least, the ICAP transformation dataset, which is a very large collection of video sequences of objects, also in this case collected to the from the ICAP robot, and containing different variations that can be very useful to assess the ability of a continual learning algorithm to generalize over time and create robust representations of those objects. But working natural video sequences is not enough, as we were saying before, for designing better continual learning algorithms. We also need to define and share among the community better metrics for assessing and comparing our continual learning algorithms. So in this paper, don't forget, there is more than forgetting. What we try to convey is the need for new metrics that are accounting especially for efficiency and scalability. For example, we should start trying to take into account the amount of memory we consume, and also if this consumption of resources is growing over time. And the same goes for the computational efficiency. So we would like to end up with a kind of a spider plot that you can see on the right, where we assess a continual learning algorithms not only for accuracy, forward transfer, backward transfer, positive or negative, but also for computational efficiency and memory usage. So let's see now some results and algorithms we have proposed over the last few years for addressing these kind of scenarios with these priorities in mind, and moving towards real-time continual learning over natural video streams. In our latest work, Latent Replay for Real-Time Continual Learning that we submitted to IRIS this year, we tried to focus on continual learning algorithms that could work on the edge. That is, learning with very tight computational and memory budgets. So we ended up with an application for Android devices, smartphone devices, that could work with no hardware acceleration and in real time could update state-of-the-art mobile net after we expose it to 20 seconds of videos. And here you can see our algorithm in action. We're not going to see the whole video here, but you can watch it directly on YouTube at the link that you can find at the bottom of this slide. So what I wanted to show here is the application very quickly that the operator is using here. So essentially, we have a bunch of classes that have been pre-trained into our model. Then the operator shows the object it wants to recognize inside this little square, and the network can guess among the classes that it has already encountered. But what's interesting is when we learn about new classes that we have never seen before, or we update the knowledge on existing classes as well. So in this case, the operator is showing an adapter that the network is not able to recognize somehow. So you can see that is exchanging it for a smartphone. But then we can improve, in this case, the ability to recognize the adapter class by showing 20 seconds of video of this new adapter just by rotating it and changing the different perspectives so that the network can build continually inferences and robust representations for the adapters. And here the gathering process finishes as well as the training after 1 second. And now we're able to recognize the adapter as well as recognizing previously learned adapters so we don't have forgetting. So the app comes with a custom version of the Café framework in which we allow training on the Android device with a C++ implementation of the AR1 algorithm we are going to discuss in a moment. And then it uses a mobile net version 1 net, pre-trained on ImageNet, and then later tuned on 10 different categories of the Core 50 dataset. Then during training and updating our model with the new video sequences, what we do is to, from the 20-second, just take 100 frames, so 5 FPS, and we use latent replay, in this case combined with other techniques, using 500 activation volumes that are kept and occupies around 2 megabytes, so very reasonable assumption for an embedded system. So the AR1 algorithm and the latent replay mechanism that we deployed for this application have been designed to be extremely light on resources, with a reduced memory footprint, minimal latency, that is training time, and a very low energy consumption. And the accuracy performance trade-off for our continual learning algorithm can be chosen based on the target platform and the problem at hand. So this is very suitable for any robotic application and embedded application, as well as for ultra-low power devices. So what about the AR1 strategy? We started to develop this strategy back in 2016, trying to mix an architectural and regularization approach, and we continued developing advances for these algorithms and better implementations. You can find more information about this strategy in our paper, Continuous Learning in Synchronous Incremental Task Scenarios. But let me spend a few more words on the advancements that we made with AR1 from 2016 to today. So we started back in 2016 with copy weights with RAINY, CWR, a simple but effective weights normalization algorithm that could work on new classes and new instances and classes scenarios. Then the next year, in 2017, we proposed an extension on CWR called CWR Plus and AR1. AR1 was proposed to combine an architectural and regularization approach to address continual learning scenarios, and essentially it was based on CWR Plus, but also combining a regularization approach for the representation layers of the network. Then in 2018, AR1 Star was proposed as an extension of AR1, essentially making AR1 working agnostically in all the 3 different scenarios: new instances, new classes, and new instances and classes. Then in 2019, AIR1 was somehow expanded to also comprehend a replay mechanism in it. But while we consider replay from the input space to be somehow nor efficient nor biologically possible, what we tried to design was a latent replay mechanism. And so we have been able with this mechanism to work on very challenging settings involving, for example, more than 391 batches of 300 images each. But let's now focus only on the latest advancement of AIR1 with latent replay, explaining it in better details. So we know that rehearsal or replay requires to store some representative examples from the past. And this works quite well for taming forgetting. ICAR, for example, is one of the best known strategy employing this technique. However, despite being, as we hinted before, already not really placeable from a biological perspective, it requires extra storage. For example, for ImageNet, if we store 20 patterns per class, the total storage is already 3.8 gigabytes, which is not ideal for robotics and embedded applications. And something that is not often considered, it also requires some extra forward and backward steps. So essentially, we're increasing the amount of computation that we need, relearning things we have already learned from. So this is because we need to mix new and old patterns, increasing the total number of epochs when we learn. So the main idea of AIR1 with latent replay is to store activations volumes at some intermediate level and not raw images. And this is the functional diagram of AIR1 working with latent replay. So here on the left, you can see our pre-trained neural network on ImageNet, and we can conveniently divide it into different parts, the low-level genetic features as well as the class-specific discriminative features. Oh, actually, we have also the output layer here, which is a third component of this network. And then we approach these different blocks in different ways. So for the low-level genetic features, which are already robust enough, we are just going to fine-tune them slowly. And then for the class-specific discriminative features, we can regularize them over time with a regularization additional loss term. And for the final up-to layer, we're going to use the standard CWR star algorithm. And you can read more details about this subcomponent of our AIR1 algorithm directly in the paper. Then what we do is to extract some activation volumes at this layer in the network and randomly from the images that we encounter over time. And then we use all these examples extracted at this level when we encounter new images. We have a new batch of data we want to process, concatenating them directly on the fly during the forward pass. Latent replay has several advantages with respect to native replay from the input space. First of all, it's very efficient. Extra forward and backward steps take place only in the upper layers in the network. It requires also less storage, and activations can be quantized, compressed with negligible accuracy losses. A nice property of latent replay is that we can decide from which level to replay our activation volumes. And this, of course, impacts on the performance and on the trade-off between the resources consumption and the accuracy. Here on the left, you can see a plot in which we show the total accuracy on the Core 50 dataset over time, encountering 391 batches of 300 images each. And we show the accuracy performances of AIR1 star, CWR star, we discussed before, and the cumulative approach of just retraining our entire model from scratch with the accumulated data. And we show that with just plain replay from the native input space with just 1,500 images, around 1.2% of the training set from Core 50, we can substantially improve the accuracy performance at the end of the training procedure. And we're just 10 points away from the cumulative approach, which can be thought as to be our upper bound. Here on the right, instead, you can see a plot in which we show the accuracy performance of the same AR1 with the replay strategy, but where we change the level from which we replay our activation volumes. So the AR1 star-free images is essentially the strategy in which we replay the raw images, so the same that you can see here on the left. And what we try to do here is to move the replay layer across the network from the input space towards the output layer. And you can see that the performance are degrading somehow proportionally. And so the nice thing is that we can find a nice trade-off in which we lose just a bit of accuracy with respect to the raw input images, what we spare a lot of computation and memory resources. We're now working to even improve AR1 with latent replay, moving towards generative replay. So the idea is to substitute this external memory in which we store the activation volumes with an additional generative model that maybe can be just a branch of our neural network that is in charge of regenerating back activation volumes at that particular layer that can be used for rehearsal purposes. This idea is very interesting for continual learning because it allows us theoretically to imagine patterns that have never existed before, even exceeding possibly using an external memory for replay. But before making this idea possible, a number of practical issues have to be solved. First of all, training a model, a generative model to produce useful images or high-dimensional patterns is not that easy to scale to complex data sets. It is okay for a MNIST of Cypher 10, but not so much for Cypher 100, ImageNet, or Core 50. Then generating features instead of raw data has been proved to be useful for continual learning. However, most of the algorithms that we propose in this area are generating patterns at the semi-last level, which are very simple to reproduce and are very low dimensional. So what we would like to do is to train the generator online and GAN approaches may be too slow to do that, especially considering a long sequence of very small batches. So the challenge is to generate complex activation volumes in near real time. And this is very challenging and something we are working on at the moment. Quickly moving towards the end of my talk, let's consider a few more research directions that can be very interesting to pursue in the near future. First of all, moving towards unsupervised training using self-supervised learning or sequence learning techniques exploiting temporal coherence, or moving towards open set classification and sparse human supervision with active learning. Another interesting line of research would be to better find hybrid continual learning strategies, mixing several mechanics for addressing forgetting and build robust representations from non-ID data. So I hope you enjoyed my talk, trying to define better priorities for current continual learning research and showing some examples of continual learning algorithms that can work within these principles and towards these goals. So if you're interested in these topics, don't hesitate to join Continual AI, a nonprofit research organization and open community on continual learning for AI, counting more than 1,000 members across the globe in 17 different time zones. And of course, if you have any question about this talk, join the next live Q&A session as soon as this video ends, or send me directly an email at vincenzo.lomonaco@unibo.it. Bye.
Thank you very much, Vincenzo. So I think I will try to make you a co-host so you can actually join for questions. 1 second. Okay, so I think you should be able to now join. Okay.
All right, can you see me and hear me?
Yes,
well?
I can see and hear
Okay,
you.
cool.
Thank you very much again for this talk. It really actually nicely contributes to the three pillars we mentioned in the beginning. So social sciences, robotics, and really bringing also the machine learning perspective. So thanks a lot. I think there's a question already on the side from what I see. So today we mainly rely on connectionist architectures, backpropagation and stochastic gradient descent for developing and training artificial continual learning models. Do you think this is the right approach if we are taking inspiration from neuroscience? And do you see any alternatives? Maybe you can start answering this and then I'll continue because there's a second part of the question as well.
So it is true that most continual learning techniques that have been developed within the deep learning framework, now they use just stochastic gradient descent as a pure optimization algorithm that we have seen applied to many different problems. And it helps, I mean, it's at the core, I would say, of the impact that deep learning had, also in terms of practical applications. But it is true that it's somehow not really effective for continual learning. So all these strategies that we have seen being developed in the last few years are what I call a bit heuristic, in the sense they try to change a bit the main optimization procedure to tame a bit, forgetting the main issue we described in the talk for continual learning. But I think that, yeah, it's something, a big change in our learning algorithms would be necessary to really go towards, machines that can learn continually. So it is true that I don't think that just following this trend may help us move forward for continual learning.
So the second part of the, sorry, you were finished. I thought you finished.
Yeah, just looking.
I can, if it's okay, I'm going to manage the questions.
Sure.
Is it all right? So the second part
Sure.
is, should we explore more biologically plausible approaches? For example, spiking neural networks or some forms of unsupervised learning?
So I think that, yeah, in the talk I mentioned the inspiration that we should look at neuroscience insights and biological learning algorithms. But it's also true that there are many subfields in machine learning that already are experimenting, let's say, different approaches that are alternatives to pure backpropagation and stochastic gradient descent. I think that, yeah, we can learn also from all these different experiments that different researchers are carrying out. For example, in the context of spiking neural networks, even though they are not super hot topic at the moment, I think there are a lot of papers that are very interesting and that are even more in line with the idea of learning continually. So also these different approaches may be very useful to better investigate and to expand towards the reach of the greater goal of continual learning. And then for unsupervised learning, yeah, unsupervised learning is more of a paradigm itself. So it can be implemented, I think, in different ways and with different approaches and algorithms. But of course, it's something that we should focus on instead of pure supervised learning. In fact, as I was mentioning in the talk, it opens up a lot of different possibilities to work on very challenging and different applications that we are not taking at the moment because we have not followed that paradigm so much.
Mm-hmm. So actually, there's a continuation question, which was the first question, but I didn't see it. So it's continuing with this unsupervised aspects, and it says, do you have any thoughts about using unsupervised or semi-supervised approaches for continual learning, particularly for learning from streaming data?
Well, so we have been proposing over the last few years a number of strategies that could work directly on streaming data. But if you want to focus especially on unsupervised learning techniques, that in that case, I would suggest to look more into all the work that's been done in the context of sequence learning, for example. In that case, I mean, many algorithms are the same that are being used within supervised learning regimes, but working with sequences, you kind of have that supervised signal of the next piece in the sequence, and so you can use these algorithms and these techniques to avoid essentially to provide additional labels or supervised signals. So there are a lot of ways in which, like in the recent trend of self-supervised learning, there are a lot of ways in which you can avoid providing additional supervised signals or labels, but still use many techniques that are being used in supervised learning over time to learn robust representations from streaming data as well.
A last question, is the streaming learning scenario almost equal to a continual learning scenario where the task is composed by one class? What do you think is the most real and or difficult one?
So sorry, can you say the question again?
Is the streaming learning scenario almost equal to a continual learning scenario where the task is composed by one class? And the question is, which one do you think is the most real or difficult one?
This is a very nice question because we happen to talk about this in our group a lot of times. So essentially, if you think of a realistic stream of data, like a video from natural images, a video, then of course, if you need to react fast to the external world and to update your model very fast, then learning one example at a time and updating your model as soon as you see just one example is needed. But I think for most applications, and even maybe for biological learning systems, being able to process just a single batch of data that is very small, maybe sometimes more useful and effective, and still provide like a way to update your model quite fast. I think these are two alternatives of learning from directly one example at a time and for small batches are two different ways of that are reasonable ways of tackling continual learning from natural videos. And I think that, of course, the most difficult one would be the one in which you learn from one example at a time.
Okay, any more questions? I can't see any. One more. How effective is HTM framework as of now from continual learning perspective?
Right. So essentially, the hierarchical temporal memories framework that was proposed, I think, more than a decade ago by Jeff Hawkins and his colleagues at Numenta is a very nice framework for biologically inspired AI systems, I think, and it evolved in different implementations. And the latest one is called the cortical learning algorithms, if I'm correct, and it evolved over time, and now it's pretty useful for continual learning from low-dimensional data. So the problem with that approach is that it's basically based on synaptic simple Hebbian rules plus neurogenesis. And so it works very well on low dimensional data, but when you want to scale that up on higher dimensional data and you want to solve the credit assignment problem, so you want to build, for example, hierarchical representations and robust representations, then in that case, it doesn't work so well at the moment, and further research should be, I mean, more effort should be put towards that goal. But it's still very interesting and nice to explore. So I would advise you to, if you're interested in that kind of algorithms, to take a look at their many papers to learn more about these algorithms, because I think there are many insights that we can take from them, and to, especially if you want to bring them over the deep learning, let's say, landscape, especially regarding the idea that I was explaining before of sparsity in terms of activations as well as connections, and all these interesting ideas that have been heavily investigated in that line of works.
Thank you very much again. So this has been really an interesting talk, Vincenzo. Thanks again for your time and effort.
Thank you very much for inviting me today.
It's been great and caused a lot of discussion as well. So to finish, Sinan just shared his screen. So we actually have a special section coming up on Frontiers called Lifelong Learning and Long-Term Human-Robot Interaction. And if you're interested in submitting a paper, so the abstract submission deadline is in October, but you can check it on the website. Sinan, maybe you can share the link on the chat as well for people who are interested. And then the actual paper submission deadline is later on in February, so you have time to prepare your papers. And thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. It has been really an insightful discussion. I'll mute myself. I think I have the neighbor coming in and not knowing I'm chairing a workshop. So maybe Sinan can say a few things.
We can hear.
Sorry. Thank you, Hatice. And I'd like to apologize for the technical problem. Somehow there was a connectivity problem, and I'm now connecting through my data package on my mobile. So this has been a really fruitful workshop focused on the different aspects of the lifelong learning problem, from neuroscience, from machine learning, and from the developmental roboticist perspective. We hope that this has been very useful for everyone, and we are interested in continuing this line of workshops in the following conferences, and we hope to see you again in these workshops. The recordings of each paper presentation and this whole session will be available on the YouTube channel. The links are going to be accessible from our workshop page. So thank you everyone for joining in, and have a nice day.
Enjoy the rest of the conference as well. Yes, thank you.
Thank you for organizing it. Have a nice day.
Bye-bye.